There is a place in the world where the Sahara meets the Mediterranean, where the oldest human footprints in North Africa press into the same earth that would one day bear the weight of Roman legions, Ottoman cannon, and French paratroopers. A place where mountains hide the ruins of civilizations most people have never heard of, and where a people whose name means simply the free men have spent 3,000 years refusing to be anything else. This is Algeria, and almost no one knows its story. Almost no one, that is, until now. What you are about to hear is not a neat history, stamped with dates and treaties and the names of kings. It is something older and stranger and more human than that. It is the story of a land that has been conquered so many times that conquest itself became a kind of tradition, and yet whose people, the Amazigh, the free men of the mountains and the desert, somehow never stopped being who they were. It is the story of a boy from western Algeria who built an army out of prayer and philosophy and held the most powerful military force on earth at bay for 15 years. It is the story of a city, a single kasbah, 1 square mile of ancient stone where the fate of empires hung in the balance. And it is the story of what happens to a people when they finally win their freedom and discover that freedom, it turns out, is only the beginning. This is Algeria. Let us begin at the beginning. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine North Africa not as it appears on a modern map, with its clean lines and color-coded sovereignty, but as it was before any of that. Before Rome. Before Carthage, before the Arab armies that swept westward in the 7th century, before even the Phoenician traders who first pressed their keels into the Mediterranean mud of what is now the Algerian coast. Go back far enough, and you arrive at a landscape that has barely changed in 10,000 years, the Tell Plains in the north, rich with winter rains and ochre soil, the Atlas Ranges folding the land into ridges and valleys, their peaks catching clouds that dissolve before they reach the plateau below, and then the Sahara, not the dead wasteland of popular imagination, but a living, breathing, ancient world of dune and stone and, if you know where to look, of water. In the mountain massif of Tassili Niger, in the far south of what is now Algeria, cave paintings have been dated to 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. They show hunters and cattle and dancers and gods. They show a world that was green once, and wet, before the great drying came. They are the oldest albums in Algeria's history, and the people who made them were already, in ways that matter, Algerian. The indigenous people of this land have called themselves by many names across the centuries. The ancient Egyptians called them the Libu. The Greeks called them the Nomades, the Wanderers, a word that would eventually become, through the peculiar alchemy of Latin, the name Numidians. The Arabs who arrived 15 centuries later called them the Berber, from which we get the colonial word Berber, a word that carries within it the echo of the Greek barbaros, the foreign sound, the incomprehensible tongue, the voice of the other. But across all these centuries, in their own language, in Tamazight, the language that is the oldest continuous spoken tongue in North Africa, they have called themselves the same thing, Amazigh, the free men, or more precisely, the noble, the free, the proud ones. And that, as we shall see, was never a boast. It was a statement of intent. By the time the Mediterranean world enters the historical record roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era, the Amazigh people are already numerous, already organized into loose confederations of tribes and clans that span the entire width of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of what is now Morocco to the edge of the Nile Delta. They are cattle herders and farmers, merchants and warriors. They ride horses with a skill that will make them the most sought-after cavalry in the ancient world. They worship gods whose names echo across the centuries in corrupted forms, gods of the mountains and the springs and the fierce desert wind. And they are, despite everything the later historical record will suggest, a people of considerable sophistication. The ancient Numidians, the Amazigh tribes of what is now northern Algeria, build cities. They create royal courts. They developed their own writing system, the Tifinagh script, which survives to this day. And they watch, with the wary intelligence of people who have always lived at the intersection of worlds, as the great powers of the ancient Mediterranean begin, one by one, to turn their eyes westward. The first to arrive in force are the Phoenicians, traders from what is now Lebanon, sharp-eyed merchants of the ancient sea routes, who establish a string of coastal trading posts along the North African shore. They found Carthage, on the northern tip of what is now Tunisia, around 814 BCE. It will become one of the great cities of the ancient world, a commercial empire so powerful and so wealthy that it will one day bring Rome itself to its knees, or nearly so. And the relationship between Carthage and the Amazigh peoples of the interior is, from the beginning, complicated. Not the simple story of colonizer and colonized, but something more nuanced, more ambiguous, more characteristic of a region where the lines between conqueror and conquered have always been difficult to draw. The Amazigh provide Carthage with soldiers, particularly their legendary cavalry, those bareback riders who need no saddle, no bridle, only a wooden rod and the intuitive communion between rider and horse that comes from a lifetime spent on the North African steppe. In return, Carthage brings wealth, urban culture, the Punic language, and the habits of a Mediterranean civilization. The Amazigh elites adopt Phoenician names, worship Phoenician gods alongside their own, and build monumental tombs that combine the step tumulus of Berber tradition with the Doric columns and Egyptian cornices of the Punic world. By the time the great clash between Carthage and Rome begins, the Amazigh of North Africa are not outsiders to Mediterranean civilization. They are, in their own way, its co-creators, but it is the Punic Wars, the three-act catastrophe that consumed much of the ancient Mediterranean world across more than a century, that brings the Amazigh most dramatically onto the stage of world history. And the figure who steps forward from that stage is one of the most remarkable men of the ancient world, Masinissa, king of the Massiliae tribe, who will become the first great king of a unified Numidia, and who will, in the process, set a template for Algerian political genius that echoes down 2,000 years of history. Masinissa was born around 240 BCE into the royal family of the eastern Numidian tribe known as the Massiliae. He was educated partly in Carthage, which at that time was still the dominant power of the western Mediterranean, and he absorbed Punic culture, Hellenistic philosophy, and, crucially, the military tactics of the greatest generals of his age. When the Second Punic War erupted in 218 BCE, with Hannibal Barca leading a Carthaginian army over the Alps and into the Italian heartland in one of the most audacious military campaigns in history, the Numidian world was divided. Masinissa's tribe, the Massiliae, initially allied with Carthage. The western Numidians, the Massicili, under their king Syphax, sided with Rome. Then, in a pivot that would define North African history for centuries, everything reversed. Syphax defected to Carthage, drawn by a marriage alliance. Masinissa, his traditional ally now his enemy's friend, made a calculation that would prove one of the most consequential in the ancient world. He switched his allegiance to Rome. It was not, in any simple sense, a betrayal. Masinissa was not a man who sold his loyalty cheaply. He was playing a longer game. He fought alongside the Roman general Scipio Africanus in the decisive campaign that ended the Second Punic War. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, it was Masinissa's Numidian cavalry that shattered the Carthaginian flanks and turned Hannibal's last great battle into a rout. And in the aftermath, Rome rewarded him magnificently. Numidia, the whole of it, east and west, the Massiliae and the defeated Massicili united, became his kingdom. For the first time in recorded history, the Amazigh peoples of what is now northern Algeria were united under a single king, a single state, a single political project. Masinissa called it the Kingdom of the Numidians. Historians would later call it simply Numidia. And for the half-century of his reign, it was one of the most vibrant and dynamic kingdoms in the ancient world. What Masinissa built was extraordinary. He turned his people from semi-nomadic pastoralists into settled farmers, introducing grain cultivation across the Numidian heartland on a scale that would eventually make North Africa the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. He built cities, most importantly Cirta, his capital, perched on its volcanic outcrop above the Rommel Gorge in what is now northeastern Algeria, a city so dramatic in its natural setting that travelers across 2,000 years have remarked on it. He sent his sons to study in Carthage and maintained a court that attracted scholars, philosophers, and artists from across the Mediterranean world. He even attracted the historian Polybius, who visited Numidia and wrote admiringly of the kingdom's prosperity and organization. Masinissa's coinage showed him in the Hellenistic style, diademed like a Greek king, with an elephant beneath, the symbol of Numidian royalty, practical proof of the military sophistication that had made his kingdom possible. And throughout his reign, he never stopped pressing against the borders of Carthage, using his Roman alliance as a diplomatic shield while he chipped away, village by village, province by province, at the remaining Punic territory. He was, in this, playing a long game against Carthage that Rome itself was also playing, and in 146 BCE, the game ended. Rome destroyed Carthage utterly, salted the earth, and turned the former Punic heartland into the Roman province of Africa. Masinissa was 90 years old when Carthage fell. He did not survive to see it, but the kingdom he had built survived him by more than a century, passing through his sons and grandsons in a complicated succession that would eventually produce one of antiquity's most dramatic political dramas, the reign of Jugurtha. Jugurtha was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary gifts and even more extraordinary ambition. The illegitimate grandson of Manissa, he had grown up in Numidia's royal household as something of an outsider, brilliant, charismatic, politically shrewd, and burning with a resentment that royal courts tend to produce in the talented but technically illegitimate. He served with distinction in the Roman army under Scipio Aemilianus during the siege of Numancia in Spain, where he cultivated friendships with Rome's future power brokers and, crucially, learned exactly how Roman politics worked, what it cost, and who you needed to pay. When his uncle Masinissa died in 118 BCE, leaving the kingdom to be shared among Jugurtha and two legitimate heirs, Jugurtha's response was characteristically direct. He had one cousin killed. He drove the other to appeal to Rome. Then, when Rome intervened and divided the kingdom, He simply waited until his remaining cousin was vulnerable, besieged him, and had him killed, executing Roman citizens who had come to his aid in the process, and thereby giving Rome a reason to declare war. The Jugurthine War, which lasted from 112 to 105 BCE, is one of the great cautionary tales of the ancient world and one of the great stories of Algerian resistance. Jugurtha was not a simple rebel. He was a strategist of genuine brilliance, who understood that the North African terrain, the mountains, the desert, the vast distances, made conventional military victory against Rome essentially impossible, but guerrilla resistance potentially sustainable indefinitely. He fought the Romans to successive stalemates. He bribed their generals. He manipulated their politics. At one point, summoned to testify before the Roman Senate itself, he reportedly said, as he walked out of the city, a city for sale and doomed to perish quickly, if it finds a buyer. He was pointing at Rome. He was not wrong about the corruption, only about the timeline. Rome did not perish quickly, and Jugurtha, eventually betrayed by his father-in-law, the Mauritanian king Bacchus, was captured, paraded through Rome in chains during the triumph of Gaius Marius, and thrown into the Mamertine prison, where he reportedly died of cold and starvation in 104 BCE. He died, but the spirit of what he represented, the refusal to accept the diminishment of the Amazigh world by outside powers, the willingness to fight not just with armies but with terrain and time, and the patient intelligence of a people who know their own land better than any invader ever could, that did not die. It went underground, as it would do again and again over the centuries. It waited. With the end of the Jugurthine War, North Africa entered more than 4 centuries of Roman rule. And those 4 centuries are not, as is sometimes implied, a blank, a pause between the Numidian drama and the Arab conquest that follows. They are, in fact, among the most important centuries in the making of Algerian identity. Because Roman Algeria, or Numidia, as it was still sometimes called, organized into the provinces of Africa Nova and Mauritania Caesariensis, is not simply a story of conquest and submission. It is a story of the most extraordinary cultural synthesis in the ancient world. Walk into the ruins of Timgad today, ancient Thamagati, founded by the Emperor Trajan in 100 CE as a settlement for Roman veterans, and you will find a city laid out with the geometric precision of Roman urban planning, its grid of streets still visible in the North African sunlight, its triumphal arch still standing, its forum, its theater, its library. But look more carefully at the inscriptions on the stones, and you find Berber names. Look at the faces on the mosaic floors, faces of landowners, magistrates, merchants, and you see the faces of Amazigh men who had taken Roman names, worn Roman togas, mastered the Latin language, and yet carried within them something older than Rome. This is what Roman Algeria was, not the erasure of the Amazigh world, but its transformation into something new and strange and deeply mixed. The Romans built roads across Algeria, roads that are still, in some places, the foundations of modern highways. They built aqueducts and amphitheaters and bathhouses. They grew grain and olives in quantities that fed Rome itself. And they did all of this with the labor and the ingenuity and the deep local knowledge of a people who had been here long before them and would be here long after. The greatest Algerian of the Roman period, and one of the greatest minds of the entire ancient world, was born in the Numidian town of Thagast in 354 CE. His name was Aurelius Augustinus Hipponensis. We know him as Saint Augustine. His mother, Monica, was a Berber Christian, deeply devout, whose faith shaped his entire intellectual and spiritual trajectory. His father, Patricius, was a Roman citizen of modest means. Augustine himself was, in every sense of the word, a product of Roman North Africa, educated in the Latin curriculum, philosophically sophisticated, morally restless, spiritually hungry in ways that the official religions of his world, both Roman paganism and the various competing versions of Christianity that were flowering across the empire, could not easily satisfy. He spent his young adulthood in dissipation and philosophical searching, working his way through Manichaeism, Neoplatonism, and various other intellectual fashions of the late Roman world, before his famous conversion to Christianity in Milan in 386 CE. He returned to North Africa, became Bishop of Hippo, modern Annaba, on the Algerian coast, and produced there, over the next 4 decades, a body of theological and philosophical writing that would shape the entire course of Western Christianity and, through it, Western civilization. The City of God. The Confessions. The theological framework of original sin and predestination and divine grace that would be argued over for 1,000 years after his death. All of it came from a man born in Algeria, of Algerian blood, whose soul was shaped by the fierce, particular landscape of a province that most Roman citizens couldn't find on a map. Augustine died in 430 CE, as the Vandals, a Germanic people who had crossed from Spain into North Africa, were literally besieging the walls of Hippo. And with his death, in a sense, an age ended. The Vandal conquest of North Africa, completed by 435 CE, brought chaos and economic disruption to a province that had been, whatever its injustices, a prosperous and culturally rich Roman world. The Vandals smashed much of what Rome had built. Then, a century later, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, reconquered the Maghreb, only to find that a century of disorder had hollowed out the administrative and agricultural systems that had made Roman North Africa so valuable. The Byzantine governors were often corrupt, the taxation was brutal, and the Amazigh population, which had never been fully subdued by anyone, despite 300 years of Roman rule, retreated further into the Atlas Ranges, into the Kabylie Highlands, into the Saharan passes, and waited again. They did not have to wait long. In the 7th century of the Common Era, something happened in the deserts of Arabia that would transform the entire world. A merchant from Mecca, a man of deep spiritual sensitivity and social conscience, began to receive what he described as divine revelations. The faith he founded, Islam, submission to the one God, spread from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and completeness that astonished the ancient world. Within a generation of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Arab armies were sweeping across the Byzantine Middle East, through Egypt, and into North Africa. The first Arab military expeditions into the Maghreb began in 647 CE. By 711 CE, they had reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco. North Africa, the land that had been Numidian, then Roman, then Vandal, then Byzantine, was now the frontier of a new and world-transforming Islamic civilization. But the Arab conquest of the Maghreb was not the easy, rapid triumph that the historical summaries sometimes suggest. The Amazigh peoples of what is now Algeria fought back, fiercely, intelligently, with the same instinct for terrain and the same refusal to accept the terms of an outsider's reality that Jugurtha had shown 7 centuries before. The most dramatic figure of the Amazigh resistance to the Arab conquest was a woman. Her Arabic name was Al-Kahina, the prophetess. Her Berber name has been lost, though some scholars believe it was Dihya. She was a queen of the Jarawa tribe, from the Ouraz Mountains in eastern Algeria, and she is one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire history of North Africa. Al-Kahina did not merely resist the Arab armies, she defeated them. In the late 690s CE, under the leadership of the Arab commander Hassan ibn al-Numan, the Arab forces that had swept across the Maghreb met a Berber army in battle and were routed so completely that Hassan retreated all the way to Cyrenaica, modern Libya, and stayed there for years, rebuilding his forces. This is not a minor detail. This was the greatest setback the Arab conquest of North Africa would face, and it was the work of an Amazigh queen, fighting on her home ground, using the mountain terrain of the Ouraz the way great Algerian commanders would always use it, as a multiplier of defensive power, a leveler of the odds. Al-Kahina reportedly employed a scorched earth strategy, destroying crops and infrastructure to deny the Arab armies the resources they needed to sustain their advance. It was a strategy of radical self-sacrifice, and it may, in the end, have contributed to her own people's growing disillusionment with her leadership. When Hassan returned with a reinforced army, he was aided by Berber defectors who had grown tired of the destruction. Al-Kahina was killed in battle around 700 CE. Before her death, according to the traditions, she sent her sons to Hassan's camp, urging them to convert to Islam and serve the new power rather than die uselessly in resistance. Whether this is historically true or later legend, it captures something real about the Amazigh response to Islam that is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Because the Amazigh did not simply submit. They converted, but they converted on their own terms, in their own time, and they brought to Islam their own fierce, independent spirit. They became among the most zealous and most creative interpreters of the new faith, producing religious movements that would sweep across North Africa and into Spain and that would challenge the orthodoxies of the caliphate with a distinctly North African radicalism. The Kharijites, a reformist, egalitarian Islamic movement that rejected the hereditary caliphate and argued for the equality of all believers regardless of ethnicity, found their greatest following not in Arabia but in Algeria. The great Kharijite state of the Rustamids, established in the mountains of western Algeria around 776 CE, lasted for a century and was governed according to principles of radical Islamic democracy that would have seemed revolutionary in any context. What was happening in Algeria, as the first Islamic centuries unfolded, was something that would define the country forever. The layering of identities. Amazigh beneath, Arab on top, the two interpenetrating and arguing and fusing in ways that produced something entirely new. Berber dynasties rose and fell, the Rustamids, the Hamidids in the north, the Zirids, each controlling different parts of the Algerian territory and each, in their own way, synthesizing the Amazigh inheritance with the Arab Islamic world that had become their cultural horizon. The Fatimids swept in from the east, claiming divine descent and imposing a Shia vision of Islamic rule that the Berber Zirids eventually rejected, triggering one of the most consequential acts of historical revenge in North African history, the Banu Hilal migration. In the 11th century, The Fatimid Caliph unleashed tens of thousands of Arab Bedouin tribes from Upper Egypt into the Maghreb as punishment for this defection. The Banu Hilal and their allies swept across the North African plains like, as one Arab historian memorably put it, a swarm of locusts. They destroyed agricultural infrastructure that had stood since Roman times. They accelerated the Arabization of the North African countryside, displacing Berber as the language of the plains and pushing Tamazight into the mountains, where it has remained ever since. They transformed the demographic character of North Africa in ways that are still debated by historians today. By the time the Almohads, another Berber dynasty, this one from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, swept eastward and unified much of North Africa and Spain under their banner in the 12th century, the picture of Algeria that emerges is already recognizably modern, predominantly Muslim, predominantly Arabic-speaking on the plains, with Amazigh-speaking communities clinging to the mountains and the desert. Urban along the coast, tribal and pastoral in the interior, rich in talent and poor in stability, perpetually contested between empires that want to use it and populations that want to be left alone. The medieval centuries, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, see Algeria fragmented among competing dynasties, the Hafsids in the east, the Zayanids in the west, the Marinids pressing in from Morocco. It is a period of genuine cultural achievement. The great Algerian city of Tlemcen, under the Zayanids, becomes one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the Islamic world, its mosques and madrasas producing scholars and poets and musicians of the first rank, but also of chronic political instability and recurring violence. And from the south, the great Saharan trade routes, gold and sultan ivory and slaves, the economic arteries of medieval West Africa, bring wealth and cultural exchange to the Algerian plateau, connecting this corner of the Mediterranean world to the vast networks of the African interior. Then, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, two events transform the situation completely. First, from the west, the Spanish Reconquista reaches its completion in 1492, when the last Muslim kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula falls to Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile and Aragon. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims, Moors, are expelled from Spain or forced to convert. Many of them come to North Africa, bringing with them skills and resentments and memories of a world they have lost. Many come to Algeria. They settle in the coastal cities, bringing Andalusian architecture, poetry, music, and cuisine, a cultural injection that will permanently mark Algerian urban identity. But they also bring something else, stories of what happens when a civilization is conquered and its people are forced to abandon everything that makes them who they are. The Moors who arrive in Algeria carry their keys, literally. For generations, they will carry the keys to the houses they left behind in Granada and Córdoba and Seville, passing them down to their children as objects of grief and longing and determination. It is a tradition that will resonate, in ways we cannot quite explain, with the experience of Algerians centuries later. The second transforming event comes from the sea. The Spanish, emboldened by their conquest of the peninsula and alarmed by the Ottoman Empire's expanding power in the eastern Mediterranean, begin establishing a string of military posts, presidios, along the North African coast. They seize Oran in 1509, and Tlemcen acknowledges Spanish suzerainty soon after. The North African coast, suddenly, is in danger of becoming a Spanish lake. And it is in this moment of crisis that two extraordinary brothers appear from the Aegean Sea and reshape the destiny of Algeria. Erij and Khizr Barbarossa were Greek-born corsairs of Albanian origin, raised in the seafaring world of the Aegean and schooled in the art of naval warfare in a time when the Mediterranean was a battlefield between the Ottoman Empire and the Christian powers of Europe. They were, by any standard, remarkable men, brave, cunning, politically astute, and possessed of a strategic vision that extended far beyond the immediate horizons of the piracy they had made their initial reputation practicing. When the rulers of Tlemcen appealed to Erij Barbarossa for help against the Spanish in 1516, he came with a fleet, with soldiers, and with the ambition to become more than a mercenary. He seized Algiers, executed the local ruler who had summoned him when the ruler became an inconvenience, and declared himself sovereign of Algeria. It was a breathtaking act of political violence. It was also, in retrospect, the beginning of Algerian statehood in a recognizably modern form. Erij was killed fighting the Spanish in 1518, a last stand in a fortress near Tlemcen, surrounded and overwhelmed, dying with the ferocity that had characterized his entire career. But his brother Khizr, who would take the honorary name Khayr ad-Din, the good of the faith, learned from Erij's overreach and made the move that would define Algeria's next 3 centuries. He offered the entire enterprise to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, requesting that Algeria be brought under Ottoman protection in exchange for Ottoman military and naval support. The Sultan accepted, and overnight, the Regency of Algiers, the Ottoman province that would serve as the foundation of the modern Algerian state, was born. Khayr ad-Din Barbarossa went on to become the greatest naval commander of the 16th century, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, the man who repeatedly humiliated the naval power of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in a series of Mediterranean campaigns that secured Ottoman dominance of the sea and made Algeria the hinge on which the entire Western Mediterranean turned. He is remembered in Algeria as a founding father, in Spain as a terror, and in the Ottoman world as a hero. He is, in truth, all three, a man whose ambition and skill shaped an entire region in ways that are still visible today. The Regency of Algiers that emerged from the Barbarossa brothers' conquests was a peculiar state, unlike almost anything else in the early modern world. Nominally subject to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, it was in practice largely autonomous, governed by a series of military governors, initially appointed from Istanbul but increasingly chosen locally by the Janissary Corps that formed the military backbone of the state, and eventually, by the late 17th century, by rulers called Deys who were essentially chosen by their own soldiers in a kind of military oligarchy. The Regency controlled the northern strip of what is now Algeria, with its capital at Algiers, and maintained a tenuous and often contested authority over the surrounding tribes through a combination of force, taxation, and the political recognition that comes from simply being there. Consistently, over a long period of time, the economy of the Regency was, famously, based substantially on what the Europeans called piracy, what the Algerians called privateering, or more grandly, the corsair tradition. The ships of Algiers ranged across the Mediterranean and beyond, capturing European merchant vessels, enslaving their crews, and holding them for ransom. It is a practice that modern sensibilities find straightforwardly indefensible, and the suffering of the hundreds of thousands of European slaves who passed through Algerian captivity was real and terrible. But it is also worth noting, as historians have increasingly emphasized, that the corsair economy was not simply brigandage. It existed within a framework of international relations and diplomatic conventions that were perfectly understood on all sides. The European powers engaged in their own forms of captive-taking and slave trading on a vastly larger scale, and the wealth generated by the corsair economy sustained an Algerian urban culture of genuine sophistication. Algiers in the 17th century was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, home to Turks and Moors and Jews and Berbers and Christian slaves, to merchants from across the Mediterranean, to scholars and poets and diplomats. The Kasbah, the ancient citadel of Algiers, expanded and beautified through the Regency period, became one of the architectural wonders of the Islamic world, a dense labyrinth of whitewashed houses climbing a hillside above the bay, its mosques and palaces and courtyards creating a world unto itself that would, 3 centuries later, become the most famous urban battlefield in the history of colonial warfare. The European powers, particularly the British, the French, and the Spanish, negotiated endlessly with the Deys of Algiers, paying tributes, signing treaties, and occasionally launching military expeditions that achieved varying degrees of success. The United States, in one of the early republic's more consequential foreign policy decisions, went to war with the Barbary states, including Algiers, in the First and Second Barbary Wars of 1801 and 1815, establishing a precedent for American naval power projection and, incidentally, providing the inspiration for a famous line in the Marines' hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli." But through all of this, Algiers survived. The Regency adapted, negotiated, paid when it had to and fought when it could. It was not the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, but it was remarkably durable, which is, in the long run, a more important quality. What ended it was not superior military force or shrewd diplomacy. What ended it was an insult, a flywhist, and the domestic political calculations of a French king who desperately needed a foreign triumph to shore up a crumbling monarchy. The insult came in 1827. The Dey of Algiers, Hussein Dey, during a meeting with the French consul Pierre Duval over a long-standing debt dispute, struck the consul in the face with a flywhist or a fan, depending on the source. The French response was to impose a naval blockade of Algiers. 3 years of blockade and negotiations followed, during which nothing was resolved. And then, in 1830, King Charles X of France, his monarchy under domestic threat from liberal opposition, his political situation increasingly desperate, made a decision that would change the fate of Algeria and France alike for the next 132 years. He ordered an invasion. On June 14, 1830, 37,000 French troops landed at Sidi Frej, 20 kilometers west of Algiers. The French commander, Marshal Bourmont, anticipated resistance. What he encountered was fierce but inadequate. The forces of the Regency, depleted by years of internal conflict and unable to concentrate against a modern European army landing on a prepared beachhead, fought hard but could not hold. In 3 weeks of fighting, the French reached Algiers. Hussein Dey surrendered on July 5, 1830. He was allowed to leave with his household and his personal wealth. The Regency of Algiers, 3 centuries of Ottoman-adjacent, corsair-funded, pragmatic North African governance, was over. What came next was supposed to be simple. It was anything but. Charles X had not, in any precise sense, planned what to do with Algeria once he had it. He wanted a victory. He got one, and it did him no good domestically. He was overthrown in the July Revolution just weeks after the fall of Algiers and replaced by the more liberal Louis Philippe. But the army was already in Algeria, the city was already occupied, and the new government, reluctant, uncertain, pulled by commercial and strategic interests it could not quite refuse, stayed. It would stay for 132 years, and in those 132 years, France did things in Algeria that France has still not fully reckoned with, because reckoning with them would require acknowledging that the Republic of Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity was also the empire of dispossession, torture, and ethnic cleansing. Not alternately, simultaneously. In the same decades when France was building its cathedral of democratic values at home, it was, across the Mediterranean, destroying centuries of Algerian civilization, burning villages, massacring populations, and conducting what historians have increasingly recognized as a slow-motion genocide of a people who had the misfortune to inhabit land that French settlers wanted. The conquest was not gentle, and it was not quick. The fall of Algiers was just the beginning. For the next 17 years, France fought one of the most grueling colonial wars in its history against a terrain, a climate, and a people that refused, absolutely and at enormous cost, to submit. The hero of that resistance, and one of the great figures in Algerian and world history, was Abdelkader Ibn Muhyiddin. He was born in 1808, the son of a respected Sufi scholar and local religious leader in the region of western Algeria. He was educated in the Islamic sciences, knew Arabic and French, had made the Hajj to Mecca, and was, by the time the French arrived, already recognized as a man of unusual gifts, intellectual, spiritual, and practical. In 1832, the tribes of western Algeria, searching for a leader who could unify their scattered resistance, turned to Abdelkader. He was 24 years old. He was a religious scholar. He had never commanded an army, and he would go on to build, from nothing, one of the most sophisticated guerrilla resistance movements the 19th century had seen. Abdelkader was not merely a military commander. He was a state builder. From his position as Emir of the Mascara, he created a functioning government, a treasury, a judiciary, a diplomatic corps, a system of taxation, a structured army that combined traditional Algerian cavalry with the weapons and tactics he had studied from the French themselves. He signed treaties with France, the Treaty of 1834 and the Treaty of Tafna in 1837, that France used to consolidate its position in the east while he consolidated his in the west. He issued proclamations of remarkable political sophistication. He protected French prisoners according to the conventions of war. He is said to have corresponded with Abraham Lincoln, with Napoleon III, with the Sultan of Morocco, with a dozen other leaders of the world. He was, in the fullest sense, an international statesman conducting a national liberation struggle from horseback in the mountains of western Algeria. His story has another dimension that is less often told: the ferocity of the French response. General Thomas Robert Bugeaud, appointed as Governor-General of Algeria in 1840, understood that conventional warfare would never subdue the Algerian resistance. His solution was systematic devastation. French troops burned villages, they destroyed crops and orchards, they poisoned wells, they drove entire populations from the land, creating what later generations would recognize as concentration camps, regroupment camps where displaced Algerians, stripped of their means of subsistence, could be watched, controlled, and slowly broken. Most notoriously, in 1845, a French officer named Colonel Pelissier sealed several hundred Algerians, men, women, and children who had taken refuge in caves in the Dara Mountains, and lit fires at the entrances. The enfumades, the smoking's out. Every person inside died of suffocation. When a journalist reported the story in the Paris press, there was public outrage. Bugeaud was briefly embarrassed. And the policy continued. Abdelkader himself was never defeated in any clear sense. He was, eventually, exhausted. His sanctuary in Morocco was ended when France pressured the Moroccan Sultan to deny him refuge after the Battle of Isly in 1844, where the French defeated a Moroccan force that had come to his aid. Without his Moroccan base, without the ability to resupply and regroup, he could no longer sustain his resistance. In December 1847, he surrendered, not in defeat, but in a negotiated capitulation, on the promise that he would be allowed to go into exile in a Muslim country. France, characteristically, immediately broke this promise. He was imprisoned at Amboise in France for 5 years, released only in 1852 after intervention from Napoleon III. What followed Abdelkader's surrender was not peace. It was pacification, a word the French preferred to conquest, with its implication that the resistance was somehow illegitimate, a mere disruption of natural order. The resistance continued. In the mountains of Kabylia, the heartland of the Amazigh-speaking Kabyle people, those relentless mountains east of Algiers where the terrain itself seemed to reject the concept of foreign authority, a woman named Lala Fatmansamur led another extraordinary resistance. She was a Sufi mystic and local religious authority who became, in the 1850s, the military and spiritual leader of the Kabyle uprising against French rule. Like Abd al-Qadir, she combined religious legitimacy with genuine military skill. Like al-Kahina 1,000 years before, she fought from the mountains. Like al-Kahina, she was eventually captured in 1857, ill and physically broken by years of guerrilla warfare in the Atlas. She died in French captivity in 1863. The French erected a monument to her a century later. It did not occur to them that this was ironic. The violence of the French conquest killed, by various estimates, between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians between 1830 and 1875 in battle. In reprisals, in the engineered famines that followed the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, and in the epidemics that swept through populations made vulnerable by displacement and malnutrition. In 1830, Algeria's population was probably around 3 million. By 1872, it had fallen to around 2.5 million. This is not just a demographic statistic. It is the measure of a catastrophe, because alongside the violence, France was doing something else, building a settler state. From the 1830s onward, French citizens were encouraged, incentivized, sometimes compelled, to settle in Algeria, on land that had been confiscated from Algerian landowners under a series of increasingly brutal property laws. French settlers, and not just French, Spanish from the neighboring province, Italians from Sicily and Sardinia, Maltese, Alsatians displaced by the Franco-Prussian War, poured into Algeria, particularly into the northern coastal plain, the Tell, where the climate was Mediterranean and the soil was rich and the Algerian owners had been conveniently removed. By 1900, there were nearly 800,000 European settlers in Algeria. By the time of the First World War, the number was over 900,000. These settlers, the Pied Noirs, the Blackfeet, as they came to be called, built cities, planted vineyards, grew citrus and wheat, developed industries. They also built, with considerable determination and creativity, a culture of privilege that was structured, at every level, to exclude the indigenous Algerian population from political rights, economic opportunity, and human dignity. The legal framework of French Algeria was a masterpiece of discriminatory design. The Senatus Consult of 1865 gave Muslim Algerians French nationality, but not French citizenship. To become a citizen, an Algerian Muslim had to renounce the personal status of Islamic law and submit entirely to the French civil code. This was not merely a legal requirement. It was, in the eyes of the religious scholars and community leaders who shaped Algerian opinion, an act of apostasy, a demand that an Algerian not merely become French but stop being Muslim. The number of Algerians who chose this option was, across the entire colonial period, vanishingly small. Most Algerians remained subjects rather than citizens, taxed, policed, conscripted when France needed them for its wars, but excluded from the political process that determined their lives, and yet Algeria was officially not a colony. From 1848, it was declared an integral part of France, not a possession or a protectorate but 3 departments of the French Republic itself, legally indistinguishable from the departments of Normandy or province. This fiction, that Algeria was France, that the Algerians were therefore Frenchmen, that the colonial violence was therefore not colonial violence, would be maintained, against all evidence, until the moment it became impossible. And it would shape, in ways that go very deep, the character of the war that eventually ended it. Between the crushing of the last major organized resistance in the 1870s and the explosion of November 1954, what was life like in Algeria for its Muslim majority? It was a life of systematic exclusion and quiet, grinding humiliation. It was a life in which the schools you could attend were inferior to the schools built for settlers' children, in which the hospital wards had separate sections marked by religion and race, in which the legal system treated you as a lesser category of human being, in which the political system gave you no voice, in which the land that your ancestors had farmed for generations could be confiscated at any time by any colonial administrator who decided it was needed for European settlement. It was also, paradoxically, a life in which some Algerians managed to acquire education, professional skills, and a deep familiarity with the French language and intellectual tradition, and from that combination of intimate knowledge and systematic exclusion came the nationalism that would eventually end the colonial project. The man who first articulated Algerian nationalism in modern political terms was Messali Hadj, a working-class Algerian from Tlemcen who had migrated to France and there encountered socialist politics, anti-colonial ideas, and the organized labor movement. In 1926, he founded the Étoile Nord-Africaine, the North African Star, and began to articulate, for the first time in explicitly political terms, the idea of Algerian independence, not integration, not equal rights within the French system. Independence. It was a radical demand in 1926, and the French colonial authorities treated it as such, banning the organization, arresting its leaders, and doing everything in their power to suppress a movement that was, they correctly perceived, a genuine threat to the order they had spent a century building. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The Algerian elite that had been formed in the French educational system was producing men who believed, with genuine conviction, that the solution to Algeria's condition was not independence but equality, full civic equality within the French Republic. Not a separate Algerian state but a genuinely French Algeria in which Muslims and Europeans were genuinely equal citizens. The most eloquent voice of this position was Ferhat Abbas, a pharmacist from Sétif, who wrote in 1936 the famous words, "I have interrogated history. I have interrogated the living and the dead. I have visited cemeteries. No one has spoken to me of Algeria. I have found Arab conquerors, Berber kings, Roman ruins, Christian basilicas. I did not find a fatherland." If there was no Algerian nation before France, the argument went, then the solution was not independence but assimilation, genuine assimilation. What killed that hope was not theory. It was a massacre. On May 8, 1945, the day that Europe celebrated the Allied victory over Nazi Germany, the day of VE Day, the day that the world exhaled after 6 years of catastrophic war, Algerians in the Sétif region took to the streets in a demonstration. They carried signs calling for Algerian rights, for the release of Messali Hadj, for independence. French police opened fire on the demonstrators. In the violence that followed, Algerians attacked Europeans across the Sétif region, killing around 100 settlers. The French response was ferocious and disproportionate beyond any military justification. French soldiers, foreign legionnaires, and settler militia conducted a campaign of mass killing that lasted weeks. Aircraft bombed villages. Warships shelled coastal towns. Summary executions were carried out on a massive scale. The official French figures acknowledged around 1,500 Algerian deaths. Algerian estimates range from 8,000 to 45,000. No one knows the true figure. What is known is that Ferhat Abbas, the man who had believed in assimilation, who had written that Algeria did not exist as a nation, stood in the rubble of Sétif and understood, at last, that equality within the French system was not going to happen. He joined the nationalist movement. The Sétif massacre did not create Algerian nationalism, but it destroyed the last credible alternative to it. What came next was a decade of political maneuvering, internal disputes within the nationalist movement, and, on the French side, a series of rigged elections, suppressed demonstrations, and misread signals that convinced the colonial administration that Algeria was, essentially, under control. It was not. In the mountains of the Ouras and the highlands of Kabylia, a group of young men, some of them veterans of the French army who had fought in Europe and Indochina and come home to find themselves treated as less than full human beings, were meeting in secret, making a plan. They called themselves the Comite Revolutionnaire d'Unite ETD Action, the CRUA. Later they would rename themselves the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN. And in October 1954, they set the date, November 1, 1954, All Saints' Day. The French called it Toussaint Rouge, the Red All Saints' Day. In the small hours of the morning, across 6 different regions of Algeria simultaneously, small groups of armed men attacked French military outposts, police stations, fuel depots, radio transmitters, and communications infrastructure. The attacks were, by the standards of what was coming, modest, a handful of casualties, limited material damage, quickly contained by the authorities. The French Interior Minister, François Mitterrand, yes, that François Mitterrand, a future president of the Republic, dismissed the attacks as banditry and stated firmly that Algeria was France and would remain so. The Governor-General said the same. The military said the same. They were, all of them, looking at the attacks and seeing what they expected to see, a nuisance, a provocation, something that could be handled with sufficient force. They were not seeing what was actually there. The beginning of one of the most consequential wars of decolonization in the history of the modern world, the FLN's founding manifesto was remarkable in its combination of idealism and strategic clarity. It called for the restoration of an Algerian state, sovereign and democratic, within the framework of Islamic principles. It reached out not only to Algerian Muslims but to all residents of Algeria, regardless of origin, who were willing to accept the national character of the new state. It explicitly distinguished between the French people, whose government it was fighting, and the French settlers, whose rights it promised to respect in the independent Algeria it was working to create. Whether this promise would be kept was another question, and a complicated one. But it was there, from the beginning, in the founding document of the revolution, an offer of inclusion, alongside the declaration of war. The French government's initial response was to send more troops. This was always its response. By 1956, the French military presence in Algeria had grown from around 70,000 soldiers to nearly 400,000. By the peak of the war, in 1958 and 1959, 500,000 French troops were deployed in Algeria, the largest French military commitment since the Second World War, in a country that was supposed to be an integral part of France, fighting insurgents who were supposed to be French citizens. The war that followed was, by any measure, one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. It was brutal on both sides. The FLN used terror bombing civilians in cafes and dance halls, assassinating Algerian moderates who were seen as collaborators, burning the farms of Algerian families who refused to pay the war tax. The French used torture, systematically, officially sanctioned, conducted on a mass scale by trained military intelligence units who justified it as a necessary tool against a terror network. The most infamous episode was the Battle of Algiers, which lasted from September 1956 to October 1957, in which the Algiers branch of the FLN, under the leadership of Larbi Ben Midi, one of the revolution's founding nine, launched a campaign of urban bombing in the heart of the capital, targeting cafes, airports, stadiums, and other civilian gathering places. The bombings were carried out by ordinary Algerians, and specifically, in some of the most famous episodes, by young women who placed their bombs in baskets and paper bags, dressed in European clothes, passed through checkpoints without suspicion. Their names are remembered: Zora Drif, Samia Lakhdari, Jamila Bouhayred. They are not remembered as terrorists in Algeria. They are remembered as heroes of the revolution, women who carried the weight of their people's determination in handbags through the cafes of a city that was not, in any meaningful sense, theirs. The bombs they planted killed civilians. That is the permanent moral weight of what they did. It is also impossible to understand without understanding the world that produced it. General Jacques Massou, commanding the French 10th Parachute Division in Algiers, received effectively unlimited authority to restore order. He used it. Within months, the FLN's urban network in Algiers had been broken, its members arrested, killed, or driven underground by a systematic campaign of intelligence gathering that relied, centrally and openly, on torture, electrical shock, waterboarding, beatings. The accounts are documented, abundant, and unambiguous. Massou himself later admitted it, in an interview that caused a political scandal decades after the war had ended. The French military won the Battle of Algiers in a military sense. It lost Algeria in a political sense. The reports of torture that leaked to the French press and the international community generated a wave of revulsion in France and abroad that began, slowly and painfully, to turn French public opinion against the war. Larbi Ben Midi himself was captured in February 1957. He appeared briefly in public, under French custody, with characteristic composure, reportedly telling his French captors that he wished he had the S-bombs to give them in exchange for their airplanes. He died in French military custody shortly afterward. The official account was suicide. The actual account, which subsequent investigation has made clear, was murder. He was strangled, his death staged to look like hanging. He was 34 years old. He is buried in Algeria as a martyr of the revolution. France has never formally apologized. The war expanded beyond Algeria's borders. The FLN established external bases in Tunisia and Morocco, both of which had gained independence from France in 1956, and used them as staging areas for supplies and fighters. France bombed a Tunisian border village, Sakiat Sidi Youssef, in February 1958, killing 80 civilians including children who were in a school at the time. The attack provoked an international crisis, a rare moment of universal condemnation of French policy that included the United States government, which was finding the Algerian war increasingly difficult to defend at the United Nations, where the newly decolonized nations of Asia and Africa were making their collective voice heard. The Bandung Conference of 1955 had brought together the leaders of the emerging Third World, Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, Nkrumah of Ghana, and the Algerian cause was front and center. It was the moment when the world's formerly colonized peoples began to act, collectively, as a political force. The provisional government was recognized by Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, China, and a growing list of others. France grew increasingly isolated. Within France itself, the Algerian war was tearing the country apart. The army and the settler community in Algeria, the Pied Noirs, now numbering over 1 million, with deep roots in a land their families had inhabited for 3, 4, 5 generations, felt that the politicians in Paris were betraying them. When a series of weak governments in the French Fourth Republic appeared to be moving toward negotiation, the army and the settlers revolted. In May 1958, French military officers and settler leaders staged an uprising in Algiers, seizing power in the colony and threatening to march on Paris. In the crisis that followed, the Fourth Republic collapsed. Charles de Gaulle, the hero of the French resistance, who had been in retirement since 1946, was brought back as the price of political stability. The army expected him to keep Algeria French. He had something else in mind, de Gaulle was not a man of sentiment when it came to political reality. He saw, with a clarity that his military colleagues refused to exercise, that the Algerian war was unwinnable in political terms, that France could win every battle and still lose the war, because the world had changed, because the colonial order was ending, and because a France that spent another decade bleeding itself dry in North Africa would emerge weakened, humiliated, and diminished from its proper place in the world. His conclusion, reached slowly, cautiously, with considerable internal resistance, was that Algeria would have to be independent. The question was how to engineer that independence in a way that preserved France's dignity and, if possible, French interests. The path to that endpoint was 3 more years of war, internal French political crisis, assassination attempts on de Gaulle himself by OAS Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, the terrorist organization of French settlers and military officers who preferred to murder their own president rather than accept Algerian independence, and a referendum in which the French public eventually voted to let Algeria go. The Evian Accords were signed on March 18, 1962. On July 1, 1962, the Algerians voted 99.72% in favor of independence. On July 5, 1962, 132 years to the day after the French had taken Algiers, Algeria became an independent nation. The celebrations in Algiers and across the country were among the most extraordinary outpourings of collective emotion in the history of the 20th century. People danced in the streets of the Kasbah. They wept on the corniche above the Mediterranean. They fired rifles into the air, an Algerian tradition that in this moment was not a threat but a cry of joy, a salute to a sky that was, for the first time in more than a century, their own. They sang the Casaman, the anthem they had written during the war, its words a promise to the martyrs who had not lived to see this day. They were 1.25 million people, the survivors of a war that had killed, depending on which figures you accept, between 400,000 and 1.5 million of their number. They were a people who had been told, for 132 years, that they did not exist as a nation. They were proving, with every dancing footstep, that they did, but the exodus that accompanied independence was, in its own way, a catastrophe. Within weeks of the ceasefire, the Pied Noirs began to leave, not in the measured, negotiated manner that the Evian Accords had envisioned, but in a panicked, heartbroken rush. By the end of 1962, nearly 1 million European settlers had left Algeria for France. They took what they could carry. They left behind everything else, the farms, the apartments, the businesses, the cemeteries where their grandparents were buried, the churches where their parents had married. Many of them had never been to France. Many of them spoke French with a Maghribi accent and felt as Algerian as they felt French. But they went, because they were afraid, because their world had ended, because the country they had believed was theirs was now unambiguously someone else's. Their story is its own tragedy, and it has never been adequately told. The Harkis, the hundreds of thousands of Algerian Muslims who had served in the French military or police, faced something worse. Left behind by the French government, which refused to evacuate them in any systematic way, they were at the mercy of an independence movement that regarded them as traitors. Thousands were killed, some by FLN fighters, some by their own neighbors, some in makeshift courts that passed judgment in hours on men who had spent years in French service. The French officers who had commanded them, and who wanted to bring them to France, were ordered not to by their government. Some defied the order and saved the people in their care. Most obeyed. The Harkis who survived and made it to France spent decades in camps on French territory. Stigmatized by both communities, too Algerian for the French, too French for the Algerians. Their descendants, the third-generation Harkis of contemporary France, are still working out what they are. The independent Algeria that emerged in the summer of 1962 was a country that had, in many ways, been hollowed out by 132 years of colonial rule. The skilled professional class, lawyers, doctors, engineers, administrators, was predominantly European, and most of them were leaving. The educational system had been designed to serve the settler community. The majority of adult Algerians were illiterate in French, though many spoke Arabic and Tamazight. The administrative institutions that had governed the country were French institutions, and the Algerians who had worked within them were mostly middle and lower-level functionaries. And the FLN itself, the organization that was now, by default, the government, was not a political party in any conventional sense. It was a coalition of armed movements, external delegations, internal wilayas, political factions, and personal rivalries that had managed to hold together during the war by the common purpose of defeating France. With France gone, the common purpose was gone, and what remained was the rivalries. The struggle for power in independent Algeria was immediate and brutal. Ahmed Ben Bella, one of the FLN's founding 9, who had spent most of the war in a French prison after his plane was intercepted and forced to land, emerged as the dominant figure. Backed by the army's external force commander, Houari Boumediene, the provisional government that had negotiated the Evian Accords was shoved aside. The regional military commanders who had actually fought the war within Algeria, the internal wilayas, were sidelined. Ben Bella became prime minister in September 1962, then president in September 1963, elected by an overwhelming majority in what was, even at this early stage, essentially a single-party vote. Algeria was formally declared an Arab, Islamic, socialist state, one of the first of the Third World socialist republics that would characterize the era of decolonization, and one of the most ambitious in its program. Ben Bella was a charismatic man with genuinely democratic instincts that his political situation consistently prevented him from acting on. He pursued Arab socialism, nationalizing industries, distributing land from the colonial estates to workers' cooperatives in a system called autogestion, trying to build in 3 years the educational and health infrastructure that France had deliberately withheld for over a century. He cultivated Nasser's Egypt, Castro's Cuba, Nehru's India, placing Algeria at the center of the Third World project of non-alignment, earning for Algiers the title it would carry for years, the Mecca of revolutionaries. He established Algeria as a sanctuary and a supporter for liberation movements across Africa, funding the ANC in South Africa, the PAIC in Guinea-Bissau, the anti-colonial movements in Angola and Mozambique and Namibia. Independent Algeria's foreign policy, in these early years, was genuinely visionary, a commitment to the idea that the principle that had justified Algeria's own revolution should be applied universally, that colonialism anywhere was an affront to humanity everywhere. But domestically, the picture was darker. Ben Bella's government grew increasingly authoritarian, suppressing opposition parties, centralizing power, and relying more and more on Boumediene's military to manage political challenges. In 1963, a border war with Morocco, the Sand War, over a disputed territory in the Sahara consumed resources and attention in a conflict that served neither country well. And within the FLN itself, the tensions between the old guard of the revolution and the new political class were approaching a breaking point. On June 19, 1965, a date that every Algerian knows, Houari Boumediene launched a bloodless coup. Ben Bella was arrested in the early morning hours, placed under house arrest, and would not be free again for 14 years. There was no popular uprising to defend him. The man who had been Algeria's revolutionary hero was swept away in hours by the institution that had always, even during the independence struggle, been the real center of power, the army. Boumediene was, in many ways, a more complex figure than his usurper's role might suggest. He was deeply nationalist, genuinely socialist in his convictions, and consumed by a vision of Algeria as a serious, modern, industrialized state, not a romantic third world republic but a real economic power with a real industrial base. He nationalized the French oil companies that had been operating in the Algerian Sahara in 1971, a decision that generated enormous revenue and enormous political credit with the Algerian population, which had watched the wealth beneath its desert flow out of the country for decades. He launched a massive industrialization program, building steel mills and petrochemical complexes and hydroelectric dams in the Algerian countryside. He reformed the educational system, expanding literacy dramatically. He launched a national agrarian revolution that redistributed land, this time going further than Ben Bella had dared, challenging the power of traditional rural landowners alongside the colonial inheritance. But Boumediene's Algeria was also a state of considerable repression. Political parties were banned. Opposition was not tolerated. The security services were powerful and unaccountable. And the ideology of Arabization, the progressive replacement of French with modern standard Arabic in education, administration, and public life, had an unintended consequence that would haunt Algeria for decades. It created a generation of young people educated in classical Arabic, a language that was not the Arabic their parents spoke at home, and that was not French, the language of the Algerian professional world. This generation, educated but economically excluded, ideologically formed in an Arabiized school system that was deeply influenced by Muslim Brotherhood teachers imported from Egypt, would provide the social base for the Islamist movement that would eventually engulf the country. Boumediene died in December 1978, of a rare blood disease, at the age of 46. He had never appointed a successor. The vacuum he left was filled by Chadli, a military officer chosen by the army's command as a compromise candidate, competent, unremarkable, unlikely to threaten the interests of anyone who mattered. Under Chadli, the oil money that had sustained Boumediene's industrialization program and suppressed social discontent began to dry up as oil prices fell in the 1980s. The state enterprises Boumediene had built proved inefficient and corrupt. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, rose. The housing crisis in Algerian cities, where rural migration had created vast informal settlements around the coastal cities, became acute, and the religious revival that had been building quietly since the 1970s began to find political expression. In October 1988, Algerian cities erupted. Riots swept through Algiers, Oran, Constantine, Annaba, the largest popular uprising in the country's history since independence. Young men, most of them poor, unemployed, and educated in a system that had equipped them for a job market that didn't exist, attacked government buildings, FLN offices, symbols of the state that had promised them everything and delivered very little. The army was sent in. The army shot them. Over 500 people were killed in 5 days. Chadli's response, extraordinary in the context of Algerian political history, was to open the political system rather than close it further. A new constitution, approved in 1989, ended the one-party system and allowed the formation of independent political parties for the first time since independence. The Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS, Front Islamique du Salat, emerged as the most powerful of these new parties, drawing on the mosque networks, the community solidarity organizations, and the deep religious conservatism that had grown in the shadow of economic failure and cultural dislocation. In the local elections of June 1990, the FIS won 54% of the vote. In the first round of parliamentary elections in December 1991, it won an absolute majority of the contested seats, putting it on track to control the National Assembly. What happened next defines Algeria to this day. On January 11, 1992, the Algerian military cancelled the election. Chadli was forced to resign. A High Council of State was established, essentially a military junta, however dressed in civilian clothing, and Algeria was placed under a state of emergency. The FIS was declared illegal. Tens of thousands of its members and supporters were arrested and sent to detention camps in the Sahara. Mohamed Boudiaf, one of the founding 9, who had spent 27 years in exile in Morocco after falling out with Boumediene, was brought back to be a figurehead president. He was genuinely popular, genuinely reform-minded, genuinely committed to confronting the corruption that had made the FIS's rise possible. He was assassinated in June 1992 by one of his own bodyguards, in circumstances that have never been fully explained, and so began what Algerians call the Black Decade, Al-Ashra al-Sada, a decade of civil war that killed, by Bouteflika's own later admission, at least 100,000 people, and possibly as many as 200,000. A decade in which the armed Islamic group, the GIA, Groupe Islamique Arme, carried out massacres of civilians on a scale that horrified the world, entire villages slaughtered in the night, cut, bodies left as warnings. A decade in which the government security forces and their paramilitary allies, the ninjas of the DGSN, committed their own atrocities, mass disappearances, torture, summary executions that were systematically denied and never officially acknowledged. A decade in which thousands of Algerian intellectuals, journalists, artists, and professionals were killed. The GIA published kill lists of westernized Algerians and worked through them methodically. A decade in which one of Algeria's finest writers, Tahar Djoud, was shot by Islamist gunmen in May 1993, just months after he had written that if you speak, you die, if you keep silent, you die, so speak and die. A decade that produced, in its horror, a generation of Algerians so traumatized by violence that they would struggle, for decades afterward, to speak about what they had seen and survived. The journalist Ghani Amouf, who covered the civil war from inside Algeria, later described driving through a checkpoint at night in the Plain, the fertile agricultural heartland south of Algiers that became one of the most violent zones of the conflict, and seeing, in her headlights, what she thought were shadows by the road. They were not shadows. Amid the decade of fear, people learned to drive with their headlights dimmed, to stay inside after dark, to move through their own country as if they were strangers in an occupied land. This is what the Black Decade did. It made Algeria foreign to itself. What ended it, slowly, imperfectly, at the cost of justice and truth, was the presidency of Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who came to power in a presidential election in 1999 that every other candidate boycotted as fraudulent, and who nevertheless immediately began the process of winding down the conflict. His Civil Concord Law, passed by referendum in 1999, offered amnesty to most Islamist fighters who agreed to lay down arms. His Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, passed by referendum in 2005, extended the amnesty further and, critically, blocked any judicial investigation of abuses committed by either side during the conflict. The families of the disappeared, the thousands of Algerians who had been taken by security forces and never seen again, were told, in effect, that the state had no obligation to account for what had happened to their sons and husbands and fathers. The price of peace was silence. Many Algerians, exhausted by violence, paid it. Many others have never forgiven it. Bouteflika was, in the early years of his presidency, an effective leader by the standards of Algerian governance, which is to say that oil revenues were high, social stability was maintained, and the country gradually rebuilt from the devastation of the civil war. He positioned Algeria as a crucial partner for Western powers in the global war on terror. After 2001, Algerian security services, with their decade of experience fighting Islamist insurgency, had knowledge and contacts that American and European agencies found invaluable. Algeria's GSPC, the Salafist group for preaching in combat, the surviving militant faction from the civil war, became the nucleus of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Akim, spreading the Algerian jihadi tradition to Mali, Niger, and beyond. The Sahara, which had been Algeria's most remote and romantic geography, became the staging ground for a new phase of regional instability that Algeria struggled, with varying success, to manage, but Bouteflika stayed too long. He won re-election in 2004, 2009, and, after pushing through a constitutional amendment to remove the two-term limit, in 2014. By 2014, he had suffered a stroke that left him visibly incapacitated. He was rarely seen in public. He communicated through intermediaries. He was, in the most literal sense, a figurehead, the civilian face of a regime run by a military and intelligence establishment that had controlled Algeria since 1965. His frail figure in a wheelchair, holding ceremonial documents that he appeared unable to read, became the image of a system that had learned to govern without governing, to lead without leading, to maintain power through inertia and petrodollars and the collective trauma of the Black Decade, which had taught an entire generation that the alternative to the current system might be something worse. And then, in February 2019, the regime announced that Bouteflika, 82 years old, stroke impaired, not seen in public for 2 years, would stand for a fifth term. The response was immediate and massive and, for a country that the world had largely given up on as a site of political change, astonishing. Millions of Algerians took to the streets. They called themselves the Hirak Arabic 4 movement. Every Friday, week after week after week, they marched. In Algiers and in Oran and in Constantine and in Annaba, in the Kabylie highlands and in the Saharan towns. They were not a political party. They had no formal leadership. They carried Algerian flags and signs that said, in Arabic and Tamazight in French, Yet Nahajia 3, all of them must go. They were telling the entire political class, not just Bouteflika, but the system behind him, that the game was over. Bouteflika resigned in April 2019. He died in 2021. But the system did not go. The military moved to manage the transition, suppressing the Hirak gradually through arrests, travel bans, and when the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in 2020, the convenient prohibition of public gatherings. New presidential elections were held. A new president, Abdelmajid Tebboune, was installed. He was, by any measure, a product of the same system that had been in place since 1965. The Hirak continued for a while after the pandemic restrictions lifted, then faded, partly due to repression, partly due to exhaustion, partly due to the fundamental problem of a mass movement that knew what it was against but had not yet built the political structures to articulate what it was for. Algeria today is a country of 45 million people, the largest in Africa by land area, if we count the Sahara, and the 10th largest in the world. It sits on some of the most significant oil and gas reserves in North Africa. Its energy revenues fund a state that has maintained a social contract, food subsidies, housing programs, free education, and healthcare that has so far prevented the kind of revolutionary rupture that toppled Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt. Its military is the most powerful in North Africa and one of the most capable in Africa as a whole. Its Sahara, that vast, ancient, magical landscape that covers 85% of the country's territory and is home to fewer than 10% of its population, contains oil and gas and solar energy potential and mineral wealth that have not yet been fully understood. And its people, the Algerians, the Amazigh, the free ones, are, as they have always been, a people of extraordinary energy and talent and frustration, straining against a political system that has not yet learned to trust them. The writers are still writing. The musicians, the Rai singers and the Chabi traditionalists and the new hip-hop generation that has grown up with satellite TV and smartphones and a knowledge of the world that their grandparents could not have imagined, are still making music that captures the particular Algerian experience of yearning and resistance and joy. The scientists and doctors and engineers in the diaspora, the Algerian communities of France and Canada and elsewhere, are building things and thinking things and dreaming things. And many of them dream of a day when they can build those things in their own country, on their own terms, without having to negotiate with a system that was designed by men who fought a war 60 years ago and have not, in any fundamental way, moved on. The question of what Algeria will become is genuinely open. It is not the question of a failed state circling the drain. It is the question of a country with enormous resources, an educated and ambitious population, and a political system that is struggling to catch up with the society that has outgrown it. It is the question of whether the generation that marched in the Hirak will find the patience and the organizational capacity to build the political alternatives that mass movements alone cannot create. It is the question of whether the memory of the revolution, of the men and women who died in the Ouraz Mountains and the streets of Algiers, who carried their determination through years of a war that most of them did not survive, who dreamed not just of independence from France but of a free, just, and dignified Algeria will remain a source of inspiration rather than a source of legitimizing mythology for a political class that has long since stopped deserving to invoke it. Masinissa, standing in the ruins of Carthage with the world remade around him, might have recognized the moment. Abdelkader, in his tent in the Atlas Mountains, composing letters in 3 languages and commanding an army through sheer force of personal authority, might have recognized the moment. Lala Fatman Sumer, riding into battle in the Kabylie highlands, might have recognized it. Larbi Ben Midi, in his French prison, staring at the ceiling and refusing to be afraid, certainly would have recognized it. Algeria is not done yet. The free men and women of the mountains and the desert and the ancient Kasbah of Algiers are not done yet. They have been here for 10,000 years, since the first hand reached out in the Tassili integer and pressed itself against cavestone in a gesture that meant, I was here, I existed. Remember me, they are still here. They are still pressing. And Algeria, in the end, will have to decide what to do with all that magnificent, impossible, unfinished freedom. There is something that the official history of the French conquest almost never mentions, the particular texture of silence that fell over Algeria in the decades after the last organized resistance was broken. Not the silence of acceptance. Not the silence of a people who had come to terms with their situation and found it, if not good, at least tolerable. It was the silence of shock, the particular human stillness that comes after catastrophe so complete and so sustained that language itself seems inadequate to the task of describing it. The missionary and writer Eugene Fromentin traveled through Algeria in the 1850s and wrote about landscapes of extraordinary beauty, the golden light over the Saharan plateaus, the lushness of the Mediterranean plain, the ancient Roman towns sleeping in the heat. He wrote very little about the people, and when he did, he described them with a detachment that is itself a form of violence, as elements of the landscape, as picturesque figures in a painting, as types rather than as human beings with interiority, with history, with grief. This was the colonial gaze, and it shaped not only how Europeans saw Algeria but, through a century of schooling in a system designed by and for European settlers, how Algerians came to see themselves, or rather, how they learned to resist seeing themselves through that gaze, because the truly extraordinary thing about the Algerian colonial experience is not that it broke the Algerian sense of self but that, despite everything, it did not. Something survived, something endured. It endured in the Sufi brotherhoods that maintained their networks of religious education and community solidarity through the colonial period, providing the social infrastructure that French colonial administration could not quite reach. It endured in the oral traditions, the Kabyle poets who sang in Tamazight, the Arab storytellers who carried the memory of the pre-colonial world in their tales, the women in the haik who transmitted household knowledge and family history through generations of colonial disruption. It endured, paradoxically, in the very French education system that the settlers had designed to produce a subservient, Frenchified Algerian elite, because it also produced, alongside the compliant clerks the colonizers wanted, a generation of Algerian intellectuals who read Rousseau and Voltaire and Marx and applied their ideas not to France but to the condition of Algeria. Consider the generation that came of age in the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s. They were young men who had, in many cases, served in the French army during the First World War. 200,000 Algerians fought in the French forces between 1914 and 1918. 35,000 of them died. They died in the trenches of the Western Front, in the mud of Flanders and Picardy, alongside French citizens who were technically their compatriots. They came home, those who came home, carrying the double experience of having proven their willingness to die for France and having received, in return, precisely nothing. Not citizenship, not land reform, not political rights, not even the kind of grudging respect that might have been expected from a nation for the men who had helped save it. They came home to the same colonial Algeria they had left, the same exclusion, the same condescension, the same legal inferiority, the same white-owned cafes with signs in the window that said no Arabs or dogs. From this generation came the first serious Algerian nationalist politics, but it was not a monolith. It was a debate passionate, sophisticated, sometimes vicious about what Algeria was, what it could be, and how to get there. On one side, Messali Hadj and the current that would eventually produce the nationalist movement, insisting on the specificity of Algerian national identity and the necessity of independence. On another, Farhad Abbas and the assimilationists, who believed that equality within the French system was both possible and desirable. And woven through both, the Islamic reformism of Ben Badis and the Association of Algerian Ulama, which argued that what Algeria needed was not political revolution but cultural and religious renewal, that Algerians needed to be more fully, more consciously, more authentically Muslim and Arab in order to resist the assimilationist pressure of French civilization. Algeria is my country, Ben Badis wrote, in a phrase that became famous, Islam is my religion, and Arabic is my language. It was a statement of identity, not a political program. But identity, as colonialism always discovers too late, is the most political thing there is. The Second World War reshaped everything. 100,000 Algerians again fought in the French forces, this time against the Axis, liberating France itself, fighting their way from North Africa through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula and eventually into France. Again they came home having proven themselves. Again they came home to find that the proof mattered not at all. The massacre at Sétif and Guelma in May 1945, that terrible, defining moment we have already described, was not only a turning point in Algerian nationalism. It was a revelation about the nature of the system they were living under, that the French Republic, the Liberty Equality Fraternity Republic, the republic that had just been liberated from Nazi occupation by armies that included Algerian soldiers, was capable of massacring thousands of its own subjects in the name of order. That the vocabulary of the rights of man did not apply, in any operative sense, to Algerians. That the gap between France's stated values and its practiced ones in Algeria was not an accident or an aberration but a structural feature of the colonial relationship, and could not be closed by argument or petition or good faith alone. After Sétif, the nationalists who believed in armed struggle gained ground steadily, and the nationalists who believed in peaceful reform lost it just as steadily. Because the lesson of Sétif seemed clear, peaceful reform was not going to happen. It took 9 more years, 9 years of organizing, of clandestine meetings in apartments in Algiers and Oran, of arms shipments from Egypt facilitated by a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser who had his own revolutionary project underway, of training camps in the mountains and of patient, dangerous intelligence gathering about French military positions, for the decision for armed insurrection to be made and acted upon. The 9 men who made that decision, Ben Bella, Boudiaf, Ben Krim, Baitat, Daidouche, Ben Boulaid, Eid Ahmed, were not, in any obvious sense, military geniuses. They were, rather, exceptionally determined ordinary people who had concluded that there was no other way. And November 1, 1954, the night their war began, was not the first shot of a revolution. It was the culmination of more than a century of resistance. What is extraordinary about the FLN's revolution, looking back on it from the distance of 7 decades, is not the military tactics, which were unremarkable, and indeed were consistently outperformed by the French military in any direct engagement. What is extraordinary is the political achievement. The FLN managed, over 8 years of brutal war, to maintain sufficient coherence, sufficient international legitimacy, and sufficient popular support within Algeria to defeat a Western power that had 500,000 soldiers in the field and was spending enormous resources, financial, military, human, to hold the territory. They did this despite internal divisions so severe that senior FLN leaders occasionally had each other killed. They did this despite the French army's systematic dismantling of the organization's urban networks. They did this despite the Morris Line, a 200-kilometer electrified fence along the Tunisian border, backed by minefields and constant French aerial surveillance, that effectively cut off the external ALN from the interior, and despite the equally formidable Chal offensive of 1959 to 1961, in which French General Maurice Chal used helicopters, napalm, and overwhelming firepower to sweep through the Algerian countryside and destroy the internal ALN's capacity for large-scale operations. They won because the political calculation changed, because France's allies grew tired of defending a colonial war that looked increasingly indefensible, because the French public, confronted with the evidence of what was being done in its name, the torture, the village burnings, the 2 million Algerians herded into regroupment camps, the disappearances that would not have seemed unfamiliar to anyone who had followed events in Nazi-occupied Europe a decade earlier, grew first uncomfortable and then genuinely horrified. Because a group of French intellectuals, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, who had been born in Algeria himself and whose relationship to the Algerian War was the most complicated, most tortured, and most revealing of any French public intellectual of his generation, Francis Jeanson, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, chose to speak publicly about what was happening, at considerable personal risk. Because the United Nations General Assembly, in which the newly independent states of Asia and Africa were now a majority, passed resolution after resolution demanding a negotiated settlement. And because de Gaulle, the most clear-eyed French politician of the 20th century, saw all of this and drew the conclusion that history required, the path to the Evian Accords was marked by some of the most extraordinary political theater of the Cold War era. De Gaulle making his mysterious, ambiguous speeches, "Je vous ai compris, I have understood you," he told a crowd of cheering Pied Noirs in Algiers in 1958, words they took as a promise to keep Algeria French and that he intended as nothing of the kind. The General's Putsch of April 1961, when 4 senior French generals, Chel, Jouhad, Salan, Zeller, seized control of Algiers and threatened to march on Paris, convinced that de Gaulle was betraying France and Algeria. The French public, organized in unions and in the streets, blocked their airports and transport links. Young French conscripts in Algeria refused to obey the generals. De Gaulle appeared on French television in full uniform and ordered the army to disobey. The putsch collapsed in 4 days, its leaders arrested or gone underground, but out of its wreckage came the OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, which would spend the next year trying to murder de Gaulle by increasingly elaborate means, bombing Algerian cafes and mosques to trigger an inter-community war, and ultimately, when Algerian independence could no longer be prevented, embarking on a scorched earth campaign to destroy everything it could not take with it. The OAS burned schools and libraries and hospitals. It bombed the University of Algiers library. It poisoned water supplies. It shot Algerians at random in the streets of Oran. It was the colonial project at its most naked and most desperate. If we cannot have this, no one can. It was, in the end, futile. The Evian Accords were signed. The colonists left. Algeria was free, but freedom, in July 1962, looked very different from what anyone had imagined during those cold nights in the Ouraz Mountains when the revolution began. The country that the FLN inherited was physically devastated and institutionally hollowed out. More than 8,000 villages had been destroyed or damaged during the war. The agricultural economy of the countryside was shattered. The regroupment camps, where 2 million Algerians had been concentrated by French military policy, forcibly removed from their lands and villages and held under military supervision, had created a massive displacement crisis, as people who had been removed from their land tried to return to find their houses burned, their orchards uprooted, their irrigation systems destroyed. The infrastructure of the cities, neglected during the war years, was straining under the weight of a population that had grown dramatically even as the economy contracted. And the 3,000 French doctors and most of the lawyers, engineers, teachers, and civil servants who had staffed the colonial administration were leaving, taking their skills and knowledge with them in a departure that was not malicious but was devastating in its practical effects. What the independent Algerian state inherited, in other words, was not just a country. It was an emergency. And it was into this emergency that the power struggle we have described, Ben Bella versus the provisional government, Boumediene versus Ben Bella, the internal Walaya commanders versus the external army, intruded immediately. The men who had fought the war were fighting each other before the ink was dry on the independence agreement. The families of the martyred, the hundreds of thousands who had died for a free Algeria, watched from their ruined villages as the survivors competed for the spoils of a victory they had paid for in blood. Ben Bella's 3 years in power were a time of genuine energy and genuine chaos. His government launched land reform, nationalized colonial properties, built schools at a pace that was genuinely impressive given the baseline from which they were starting. His foreign policy was ambitious and coherent. Algeria hosted the first Heads of State Summit of the Non-Aligned Movement in 1973, projecting an image of Algerian leadership in the Third World Project that was, for a few years, more than mere posturing. The country became, as we have said, the Mecca of revolutionaries. Nelson Mandela came to train with the Algerian military. Che Guevara visited. Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, the Palestinian resistance leaders. The Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver eventually took refuge there. At a moment when it seemed like the colonial order might genuinely be dismantled across the world, Algiers was the city where the future was being imagined. But Ben Bella was governing over a coalition that didn't really govern, a collection of competing factions united only by the FLN brand name and the shared experience of the war, disagreeing about everything from economic policy to the role of Islam to the relationship with France. And the army, which had made him president, grew impatient with his increasing reliance on personal charisma over institutional management. Boumediene, who had been the military commander who gave Ben Bella his power base, concluded, correctly, that Ben Bella was not the builder Algeria needed. On the morning of June 19, 1965, Boumediene's forces surrounded the presidential palace in the pre-dawn dark. Ben Bella was arrested without a shot fired. A council of revolution. In practice, Boumediene took power. Boumediene's Algeria is the Algeria that is hardest to judge fairly. He was an autocrat who imprisoned or killed political opponents and tolerated no meaningful dissent. He was also an extraordinary builder. In the 13 years of his presidency, Algeria was transformed from a post-colonial ruin to one of the most industrialized economies in Africa. Sonatrach, the national oil and gas company that Boumediene built and then used to nationalize the French energy operations in 1971, became one of the most important corporations in the Arab world, its revenues funding everything from steel plants and tractor factories to schools and hospitals and public housing. The literacy rate rose from around 10% at independence to over 50% by the late 1970s. Life expectancy climbed dramatically. The infant mortality rate fell. Universal primary education, in practice, not just in theory, was achieved. By any development metric that does not include political freedom, Boumediene's Algeria was a success story. And yet, the structural choices he made, the single-party state, the suppression of civil society, the Arabization program that created a generation educated in a language that didn't correspond to their spoken world, the dependence on hydrocarbon revenues that made economic diversification unnecessary in good times and catastrophic in bad ones, all of these planted seeds of the crisis that would erupt after his death. The oil price crash of the 1980s exposed how completely Boumeddine's model had failed to create a sustainable, diversified economy. The social programs that depended on oil revenues became impossible to maintain at their former levels. Unemployment rose, inequality grew, and the generation formed in the Arabiized school system, deeply religious, educated in Islamic sciences rather than technical and professional disciplines, finding no place in a formal economy that still ran in French, began to look for another way. The riots of October 1988 were, in retrospect, the hinge on which modern Algeria turns. Everything that has happened since the democratic opening, the FIS's rise, the military coup, the Black Decade, the Hirak, flows from those 5 days in which Algerian youth took to the streets and the Algerian army shot them. But what is perhaps most remarkable about October 1988 is not the violence but what came after it, the decision by Chadli Benjedid, under pressure that he could not ignore, to actually liberalize. The 1989 constitution that ended the one-party system was not cynical manipulation. It was a genuine, if belated and perhaps desperate, attempt to open a political system that had been closed for a quarter century. The tragedy is what happened when it opened. The Islamic Salvation Front is the great what-if of modern Algerian history. What if the military had let the elections run their course? What if the FIS had entered government, been faced with the practical realities of governing a complex, oil-dependent state, had to compromise, moderate, deliver? The historical parallel that is always invoked is Turkey, where decades of secular military government gave way gradually to Islamist politics, with consequences that have been neither uniformly good nor uniformly catastrophic but that have at least taken place within the framework of electoral politics. The Algerian military looked at the FIS election victory and saw, not an Islamist party that might govern moderately, but a threat to everything that the military, the state, and the secular professional classes had built. They cancelled the election, and in doing so, they chose civil war. The Civil War, the Black Decade, the decade that Algerians still find difficult to discuss in full, was a conflict of extreme brutality and extreme confusion, in which the perpetrators of violence were often deliberately obscured and the victims were, almost by definition, the people least responsible for what was happening. The GIA, the armed Islamic group that emerged from the wreckage of the FIS after the military coup, was responsible for some of the most appalling massacres of civilians in modern history. The Ben Talha massacre of September 1997, in which over 200 people were killed in a single night in a suburb south of Algiers, remains one of the most haunting events in Algerian collective memory. But the GIA was not acting in a vacuum. And the security forces, the intelligence agency, the army, the paramilitary groups known as the Patriots or self-defense groups that the government armed and deployed in rural areas, committed their own atrocities that were systematic, documented, and officially denied. The question of who was responsible for specific massacres, a question that seems simple but is, in the fog of a civil war conducted largely in darkness and silence, genuinely difficult, has never been answered. This is not an accident. The amnesty laws that Bouteflika enacted were specifically designed to prevent the answering of that question, to close the files of the Black Decade before truth and reconciliation processes could do what they had done in South Africa or Argentina, name names, establish facts, and create a historical record that survivors and victims' families could look at and say, this is what happened to us, and this is who did it, and this is what we are owed. Algeria chose not to do that. It chose the quick reconciliation that is, in practice, impunity. And the cost of that choice is still being paid in the culture of silence that surrounds the Civil War years. In the inability to build genuine democratic accountability when the crimes of the state have been declared off-limits for investigation, in the persistence of a political model in which the military's authority is real but unacknowledged and the civilian government's authority is formal but hollow, the generation that grew up during the Black Decade, born in the 1980s, adolescents or young adults during the worst years of violence, is the generation of the Hirak. They were the ones in the streets every Friday. They are the ones who had grown up hearing, not quite, what had happened during the 1990s, the hints and silences and changed subjects that signal the things adults cannot bring themselves to say directly, and who had drawn their own conclusions about the system that had produced that decade and then covered it up. They were also the generation formed by satellite television, by the internet, by an awareness of a wider world that their parents had not had access to. They watched the Arab Spring unfold in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Syria in 2011, watched what happened when people rose up, some of those rising successfully, others catastrophically. They learned from what they watched. And when they finally rose themselves, in 2019, they rose in a way that was remarkable for its discipline, its restraint, its humor, its specifically Algerian character. The Hirak was not the Arab Spring. It explicitly rejected the comparisons. It was not interested in revolutionary violence. It did not want a Libya or a Syria. It wanted, with remarkable precision and persistence, the removal of the system el pouvoir, the power, the opaque military-civilian establishment that had governed Algeria since 1965. It carried Algerian flags, not Islamist banners. It sang the Kas Aman, the independence anthem. It made jokes. Algerian political humor is some of the best in the world, a survival mechanism developed over generations of living under rulers you cannot safely criticize directly. The signs held up in the Hirak marches were witty, specific, and devastating. One, widely photographed, showed a cartoon of the Algerian political system with the caption, "The deep state, the same faces, the same suits, the same lies." Bouteflika resigned in April 2019, after the army withdrew its support, the army's withdrawal being the real mechanism of political change in Algeria, as it had been in 1965 and 1992 and at every other crucial political moment. The Hirak continued to march, demanding not just Bouteflika's removal but the system's transformation. The system responded by managing the transition, holding elections that the Hirak boycotted, installing Tebboune as president, and then, when COVID-19 provided the legal justification, suppressing the marches through emergency public health regulations. When the marches resumed in 2021, activists were arrested, journalists were imprisoned, academics were prosecuted. The state used the full weight of its legal apparatus to make the price of public dissent high enough to deter all but the most committed. It is tempting, looking at all of this, to feel despair about Algeria's political future. The system has survived every challenge, the Black Decade, the Arab Spring, the Hirak, and emerged, if not stronger, at least still standing. The military's hold on power appears as solid as it ever was. The economic model, distribute enough hydrocarbon revenue as social transfers to prevent the kind of desperate poverty that drives truly revolutionary situations, while maintaining political control through repression, co-optation, and the managed distribution of patronage, continues to function, after a fashion, even as oil and gas revenues fluctuate and the population grows faster than the economy. But despair, in the Algerian context, seems premature. This is a country whose people have endured Ottoman rule, French colonial rule, a catastrophic war of independence, an authoritarian socialist state, a military coup, a civil war, and 2 more decades of authoritarian civilian-military co-governance, and who have, through all of it, maintained a cultural and intellectual vitality that is one of the most remarkable things about the North African world. The Algerian diaspora in France, the children and grandchildren of the immigration that French economic growth demanded and French cultural politics has struggled to absorb, has produced writers like Asha Djeber, whose prose about Algerian women's experience is among the finest French-language literature of the 20th century. Walem Sansal, whose novels interrogate the history of violence and the seductions of ideology. Kamel Daoud, whose reimagining of Camus' L'Étranger from the perspective of the Arab victim is one of the most important Algerian literary acts of the 21st century. The rhyme music that emerged from Oran in the 1970s and 1980s, that electric fusion of Bedouin song and Western pop and Andalusian melody that became the soundtrack of Algerian urban life and then of the Algerian diaspora and then of the world, is itself an argument about Algeria's capacity for synthesis, for taking the materials of its complex history and making something new and vibrant and entirely its own. There is a particular quality to the Algerian relationship with the past that is worth naming, because it shapes everything about the country's present. It is not nostalgia, exactly. Nostalgia implies a wish to return. Algerians do not, on the whole, wish to return to any previous moment in their history, not to the pre-colonial world, which was neither free nor just by modern standards, not to the revolution, which was heroic and terrible, not to the early independence years, which were charged with hope and riven with violence. What Algerians carry, instead, is a kind of unfinished accounting, the sense that history has not yet given them what they are owed, that the sacrifices of the past have not been converted into the dignity and freedom of the present. It is the feeling that Algeria's story is not over, that the last chapter has not been written, that the promise of the revolution, of a free, just, dignified Algeria, remains unfulfilled and therefore remains a legitimate claim on the future. This sense of unfinished business is not paralyzing. It is, in some ways, energizing, the source of the political energy that produced the Hirak, the creative energy that produces the writers and musicians and filmmakers and entrepreneurs who continue to emerge from this complicated country despite everything that conspires to prevent them. It is also the source of a particular Algerian stubbornness, a quality that has been noted by every outside observer who has tried to govern or understand this land. From the Roman generals who found the Numidian cavalry impossible to subdue to the French administrators who discovered that the Kabyle highlands never really submitted to anyone. Stubbornness is a virtue when you are fighting for your dignity. It becomes complicated when what you need is political compromise and institutional trust building. Algeria has more than enough of the former, and is still working on the latter. The Sahara, which covers 85% of Algeria's territory, is in some ways the key to its future. It contains the oil and gas that have funded the state since independence. It contains enormous deposits of iron ore and phosphate and rare earth minerals that the 21st century's energy transition will make increasingly valuable. It contains solar energy potential that is, in purely physical terms, almost incomprehensible in its scale. The Sahara receives more solar energy per square meter per year than almost any other place on Earth, and Algeria's solar resources are among the largest in the world. If that potential were harnessed at even a fraction of its physical capacity, the economic transformation it would enable would dwarf anything that oil and gas have produced. But the Sahara is also the home of some of the world's most complex and interconnected security challenges. The collapse of the Libyan state after 2011 flooded the Sahel with weapons and fighters. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the organization that grew out of Algeria's own civil war, and that Algeria's intelligence services understand better than any outside agency, continues to operate across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, exploiting the governance vacuums created by failing states. The Tuareg rebellions that have periodically destabilized Mali have deep roots in Algerian territory, where the Tuareg and Amazigh people of the Sahara, who have their own long history of resistance to outside authority, have never fully accepted the national boundaries that colonial cartography imposed on their ancestral world. Algeria has consistently tried to manage these regional security challenges through diplomacy, mediating Malian peace agreements, coordinating counter-terrorism intelligence with Western partners, building the border security infrastructure that tries to contain the flows of arms and fighters and migrants. But the challenges are structural, regional, and beyond any single country's capacity to resolve. And then there is the water. The aquifers beneath the Algerian Sahara contain ancient water, fossil water, accumulated over millennia during the wetter climate of 10,000 years ago, and they are being drawn down faster than they can be replenished. The agriculture that the desert towns and oases depend on is, in this sense, mining a non-renewable resource. As the global climate warms, as the Sahara continues its millennia-long expansion northward, and as the Mediterranean rainfall patterns that have always defined Algerian agriculture become more erratic and less reliable, Algeria faces a water challenge that no government policy has yet adequately addressed. The next generation of Algerian leaders will have to grapple with questions about resource management and agricultural adaptation and urban water supply that make the political conflicts of the present look relatively manageable. These are the challenges of a country, not a symbol. Algeria is too often discussed as a symbol of anti-colonial revolution, or of failed decolonization, or of the danger of Islamist politics, or of the resilience of authoritarianism, or of the promise of the Arab world's demographic youth. It is all of these things, in different contexts and at different moments. But it is, before and beneath all of these symbolic roles, a country, a specific place with specific people and specific landscapes and specific problems and specific capacities, a place where 10,000 years of human presence have produced a culture of extraordinary richness and complexity, a place whose fate matters not just as a symbol but as a lived reality for 45 million people who are doing their best to navigate an inheritance of conquest and resistance and revolution and betrayal and endurance and hope. The cave painters of Tassili-Niger, those nameless ancestors who pressed their hands against the rock in the ancient Sahara, could not have imagined what the land they called home would become. Masinissa, building his Numidian state on the ruins of Carthaginian influence, could not have foreseen the Roman aqueducts that would one day carry water to cities built over his capital. Saint Augustine, writing his Confessions in Hippo Regius, could not have known that the language in which he wrote would survive for 15 more centuries as the language of a tradition that his theology helped to shape. Al-Kahina, riding into the Oris to face Hassan ibn al-Numan's armies, could not have imagined the minaret that would one day rise where her fortress stood. Abdelkader, composing his Arabic-French-Berber correspondence in a mountain tent, could not have foreseen the Algerian Republic that would eventually name a city for him and put his portrait on its currency. Ben Midi, in his French prison, staring at the ceiling and composing the words he would say to his captors, composing them with the same philosophical clarity he had always brought to everything, could not have known that decades later, school children across Algeria would learn his name as one of the martyrs of the revolution. They could not know. None of them could know. History is not lived with foreknowledge. It is lived in the dark, with imperfect information and competing imperatives and the constant pressure of events that refuse to wait for anyone to be ready. What is extraordinary about Algeria, what makes it, for all its troubles, One of the most fascinating stories in the human record is not the wisdom of its leaders or the beauty of its landscape or even the courage of its people, though all of these things are real. It is the persistence, the absolute, unreasonable, magnificent persistence of a people who have been told, in every century and by every power that has passed through their land, that they are not quite who they think they are, not quite civilized enough, not quite sophisticated enough, not quite the right religion or the right language or the right race, and who have responded, generation after generation, in the same way that Masinissa responded to the power of Carthage and Rome, and Jugurtha to Rome, and Al-Kahina to the Arab armies, and Abdelkader to France, and the FLN to 500,000 French soldiers, and the Hirak to El Pouvoir, by continuing to exist, and insisting on it. Algeria was not built to be convenient. It was not built to be easily governed or easily understood. It was built, over 10,000 years of human habitation and 3,000 years of recorded history, to be itself contested, complicated, contradictory, and enduring. And if the story of the past 3,000 years teaches us anything about what comes next, it is this: whatever comes next, Algeria will still be there. Older than Rome, older than the Arab conquest, older than France. As old as the painted hand on the cave wall in the Tassili Eniger, reaching out across 10,000 years to say, I was here, I existed, and I am not finished yet. But to tell Algeria's story properly, we cannot race through the Ottoman centuries as though they were a waiting room between two more dramatic epochs. The 300 years of the Regency of Algiers, from the 1520s to 1830, were not a parenthesis. They were the period in which something recognizably Algerian began to crystallize, in which the city of Algiers itself became a serious Mediterranean power, in which the mixing of peoples and traditions and languages that had been happening in this land for 3 millennia produced, at last, a political entity with a distinct character and a distinct identity. The Regency was governed, as we have said, by a series of evolving institutions, the Beylerbey appointed from Istanbul, then the Aga of the Janissaries, then the Dey elected by the Janissary Corps itself. But beneath this changing formal structure, what actually ran Algiers was a commercial and military system of extraordinary complexity. The Janissaries, soldiers recruited originally from the Devshirme system of the Ottoman Empire, bringing boys from Anatolia and the Balkans and converting them to Ottoman service, were the backbone of the military. But they intermarried with local women, produced children who were called the Kalulis, who occupied an intermediate social position and who became, over generations, deeply rooted in Algerian society. The merchant class of the city was genuinely cosmopolitan: Algerian Muslims, Jews who had come from Spain after the Reconquista, and whose community in Algiers dated back even further, to the Roman period, renegades, Europeans who had converted to Islam and taken service with the Regency, often becoming its most capable corsair captains and naval commanders. The greatest corsair captain of the 17th century, Murad Rees the Elder, was a converted Dutchman. His son, Murad Rees the Younger, also known as Jan Janson van Haarlem, was another Dutchman turned corsair admiral who raided as far as Iceland and Ireland, taking captives who ended up sold in Algiers. It was, in other words, a world of genuine mobility and genuine mixing, not the static, traditional, unchanging society that European travelers like to describe, but a dynamic commercial hub that was deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean economy even as it challenged that economy's established powers. The corsair economy was real, and its violence was real. But the Regency was also a functioning state that issued diplomatic communications to European courts, negotiated treaties, maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy, and produced Islamic scholars and poets of genuine distinction. The Mosque of Sidi Abderrahmane in the Algiers Kasbah, built in the 18th century, is one of the finest examples of Ottoman Algerian architecture in existence. The tradition of the Malouf, the classical Andalusian-derived music that has been played in the great houses of Algiers and Tlemcen and Constantine for 5 centuries, is a living monument to the richness of the cultural world the Regency sustained. It is also worth understanding what the Regency was not. It was not a coherent, centralized state in the modern sense. Its authority over the interior of Algeria was real but limited and often negotiated rather than imposed. The great tribal confederations, the Moxon tribes who provided auxiliary forces and collected taxes on behalf of the Regency, and the Seba tribes who paid nominal allegiance but governed themselves, maintained their own social and political structures largely intact. The Regency taxed and occasionally punished. It did not attempt the kind of comprehensive administrative control that the French colonial state would later try, with catastrophic results. This relative autonomy of the interior, the fact that the mountains and the desert remained, in practical terms, out of reach of any central authority, was both a strength and a weakness. It made the Algerian interior resilient and self-sufficient. It also made it, from the perspective of anyone trying to build a unified modern state, extremely difficult to govern. When the French arrived in 1830, they encountered not a simple colonial blank space but a complicated social reality that they consistently misread. They expected to find a barbarous, backward society waiting to be civilized. They found, instead, a world with its own institutions, its own laws, its own networks of religious authority, its own agricultural systems, its own commercial relationships. They found the Sufi brotherhoods, the Qadariya, the Tijaniya, the Rahmaniya, that provided both spiritual guidance and social organization to millions of Algerians, and whose networks of zawiya, or religious lodges, formed an alternative structure of authority that the colonial state spent a century trying to control, co-opt, and ultimately failed to destroy. They found the Islamic legal system, the Sharia courts, the Qadis, the scholars of fiqh, that had governed Algerian civil life for centuries, and that could not simply be replaced by French civil law without destroying the social fabric that depended on it. They found the religious endowments, the waqf properties, dedicated to the support of mosques and schools and charitable institutions, that were the material foundation of Algerian religious life, and which the colonial state would spend decades confiscating and redirecting. The French did all of this: confiscated, redirected, replaced, suppressed, with a combination of legal ingenuity, military force, and ideological conviction that was genuinely impressive in its comprehensiveness. The Ordinance of 1844 gave French authorities the power to confiscate waqf properties. The cantonment policy of the 1840s and 1850s drove tribal populations off their traditional grazing and farming lands and confined them to smaller territories, freeing the more productive land for settler occupation. The Senatus Consult of 1863 was supposed to clarify tribal land rights but in practice facilitated the conversion of collective tribal lands into individual properties that could then be sold, and which were very often sold, because their owners were in debt, because they had been impoverished by taxation and displacement, because the money offered seemed substantial in the short term and the long-term cost of losing the land was not immediately apparent. In this way, millions of hectares of Algerian agricultural land passed into European ownership over the course of the 19th century, not all at once, not always by force, but systematically, legally, and in ways that were essentially irreversible. The social consequences of this land transfer were devastating and cascading. Algerian farmers who lost their land moved to the cities, where there was little work for them. They moved to the margins of European-owned farms, where they worked as sharecroppers or day laborers under conditions that were extractive and humiliating. They moved into the overcrowded poor quarters of the colonial cities, the Arab quarters, the kasbahs, the bidonvilles, where the infrastructure was minimal and the opportunities were few. The colonial economy did generate growth and wealth, but it generated them disproportionately for the European settler community, and the growth that benefited Algerians was limited and precarious. By the turn of the 20th century, the gap in living standards between the European and Muslim communities in Algeria was enormous, not the gap between a developed and a developing economy, but the gap between two communities living in the same place under radically different legal and economic regimes, one of which was designed to benefit from the other's labor while excluding it from political voice. This was the world that produced the generation of 1954. But it is important not to flatten that world into simple victimhood, because it was also a world of remarkable human complexity. Algerian society under colonialism was not monolithic. There were Algerians who collaborated with the colonial system and prospered within it, cadres appointed by the French to administer rural areas, merchants who found niches in the colonial economy, professionals who navigated the French educational system and built careers within its constraints. There were Algerians who withdrew entirely from the colonial world and maintained the internal life of traditional Muslim society as best they could, in the mosques and the zawiya and the home, shielded from the worst intrusions of the colonial state by geography or obstinacy or the practical limits of colonial administration. And there were Algerians, an increasing number, decade by decade, who absorbed French education and French ideas and French language and used them to articulate, with increasing clarity and force, the case for their own liberation. The poets of the colonial period, Mufti Zakaria, who would write the words of the Kassaman, Jean Amrouche, the Kabyle poet who wrote in French about the divided consciousness of a colonized people, Malek Haddad, who described himself as in exile in the French language, were doing something that is easy to underestimate. They were creating, word by word and image by image, the consciousness of a nation that French colonialism had insisted did not exist. When Farhat Abbas wrote, in 1936, that he could not find Algeria in history, and when he later recanted that statement, under the pressure of Sétif and its aftermath, and dedicated himself to the independence movement. He was tracing the arc of an entire generation's intellectual journey, the journey from the belief that Algeria could be transformed by assimilation into something worth being, to the recognition that Algeria already was something worth being, and that what it needed was not transformation but liberation. The physical landscape of Algeria carries all of this history in layers that are still visible if you know how to look. In Timgad and Gemala and Tipaza, the Roman ruins stand in the North African light with the uncanny perfection of things built to last, the grid of Timgad streets, the Forum of Gemala balanced on its hilltop, the Basilica of Tipaza where Saint Augustine's mother Monica is said to have prayed. In the Kasbah of Algiers, declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1992, in the same year that the Civil War began, which is the kind of irony that Algerian history specializes in the Ottoman architecture of the great mosques and the merchants' houses and the small, steep alleyways that climb from the lower city to the citadel. In the Roman Arch of Timgad and the Ottoman Gateway of the Kasbah and the French colonial buildings of the Boulevard Victor Hugo, now the Boulevard Comisti, in downtown Algiers, you can read three civilizations laid over each other like geological strata, each one shaped by and shaping the ones that came before and after. And in the countryside, in the Ouras Mountains where Ben Boulaid launched the first shots of the revolution from a mountain village in the pre-dawn dark of November 1, 1954. In the Kabylie Highlands where the Amazigh language and culture have survived 15 centuries of Arabization and a century and a half of Frenchification. In the oasis towns of the Sahara where the palm trees were planted 2,000 years ago by farmers whose descendants still harvest the same dates. In all of these places, the continuity of Algerian life is palpable in a way that no history book can quite capture. The land remembers, even when the people have been compelled to forget. The Amazigh question is, in many ways, the most unresolved of all the questions that independent Algeria inherited from its colonial past. The project of national identity that the FLN articulated during the revolution and that the post-independence state institutionalized was centered on Arab Islamic identity, on the language of the Quran, on the history of the Arab world, on solidarity with the Pan-Arab project of Nasser and the Ba'athist parties of Syria and Iraq. This was politically comprehensible. France had used the Amazigh identity, and particularly the Kabyle people's distinctness, as a tool of colonial division, with the Kabyle myth that portrayed the Kabyles as more European, more rational, more amenable to French civilization than the Arab Muslims of the plains. The colonial policy of encouraging Kabyle identity was a policy of divide and rule, and the FLN's insistence on a unified Arab Islamic Algerian identity was, in part, a response to that colonial manipulation. But it was also, for the Kabyle people and for other Tamazight-speaking communities, a form of erasure, a demand that they subordinate an identity that was thousands of years old to a national project that their ancestors had inhabited, literally, before Arabic was spoken anywhere near North Africa. The Berber Spring of 1980 was the first organized public challenge to this erasure. When the Kabyle singer Launi's 8 Mengwalid was prevented from giving a concert at the University of Tizi Ouzou because he performed in Tamazight, students and intellectuals in Kabylia erupted in protests that spread across the region. The protests were met with arrests and repression, but they marked the beginning of a sustained cultural and political movement, the movement for Amazigh recognition, that would grow over the following decades and become one of the defining tensions of post-independence Algerian identity politics. In 2002, following protests that killed over 100 young Kabyles in the Black Spring of 2001, the Algerian government finally recognized Tamazight as a national language. In 2016, a constitutional amendment elevated it to an official language alongside Arabic. These were real concessions, won by real struggle. They were also inadequate and only partially implemented. Tamazight instruction in schools remains limited, Amazigh language media is underfunded, and the cultural recognition that the language reform implies has not been followed through into the kind of genuine pluralism that the Amazigh movement has demanded. The Hirak of 2019, significantly, was the first major Algerian political movement that flew both the Algerian national flag and the Amazigh flag, the Berber banner with its blue, green, and yellow stripes and its Central Azza symbol, simultaneously, without apparent contradiction. This was a genuine new development. A generation of Algerians that had grown up with the debates about Amazigh identity as part of their political horizon, and that had concluded that you could be both Algerian and Amazigh, both Arab and Kabyle, both Muslim and attached to a pre-Islamic cultural inheritance, without any of these identities cancelling out the others. It was, in a small way, the realization of what Abdelkader's revolution had promised but not delivered, an Algeria capacious enough for all the Algerians who had always been there. The music of Algeria, and music matters enormously in this country, in ways that serious historians do not always take seriously enough, tells this story better than any political analysis. Rai, the music that emerged from the working-class suburbs of Oran in the 1970s, is a genre that defies simple categorization. Its roots are in Bedouin sung poetry, the traditional oral literature of the western Algerian countryside, with its themes of love and loss and exile and desire. Its electric instruments and rhythmic innovations came from Western rock and pop and the Egyptian music that reached Algeria through radio and cassette tapes. Its subject matter, love affairs, alcohol, emigration, the difficulties of life in a society caught between tradition and modernity, was, and in some contexts still is, considered scandalous by religious conservatives and embarrassing by the educated middle class. Cheikh Hasni, the greatest Rai singer of his generation, was assassinated in Oran in 1994 during the Civil War, by gunmen who considered his music immoral. He was 26 years old. He had recorded more than 100 albums. He died in the street outside his apartment building, and the people of Oran wept for him with an outpouring of grief that suggested that he had been saying things for them that they had not been able to say for themselves. Khaled Cheb Khaled, the king of Rai, took the music international, recording albums in Paris and singing in Arabic and French and occasionally Berber, navigating the complicated identity politics of the Algerian diaspora in France while maintaining his connection to the tradition he had grown up with in Oran. His song Didi became one of the best-selling Arabic-language songs in history, not just in the Arab world but globally. This is not a trivial fact. It suggests that something in the Rai tradition, its emotional directness, its rhythmic drive, its refusal to separate pleasure from pain, spoke to experiences and feelings that transcended the specific Algerian context that produced it. It spoke, perhaps, to the universal experience of being between worlds, between tradition and modernity, between the country you left and the country you are in, between the person your family expects you to be and the person you are becoming. This in-between condition is, in many ways, the permanent condition of modern Algeria. Between the Arabic of the Quran and the French of the university, between the Tamazight of the mountains and the Darija of the street, between the revolutionary legitimacy of the independence generation and the frustrated ambitions of the youth who make up the majority of the population, between the oil-funded social contract of the present and the uncertain post-hydrocarbon future that the 21st century requires. Algeria is permanently in transition, permanently negotiating between what it was and what it might become, permanently carrying the weight of a history that is, in every sense of the word, unfinished. What would Algeria need to become the country that its people deserve? The question is not difficult to answer in the abstract. It would need genuine political pluralism, not the managed, controlled multi-party system of the post-1989 period, in which parties exist but real power remains permanently with the military establishment, but actual democratic governance in which elections produce real changes in policy and real accountability for those who govern. It would need an economy that creates opportunities for its young population, not through the distribution of oil revenues that create dependency and discourage productive activity, but through the diversification of the economic base, the development of industry and agriculture and services and technology, the integration of Algeria into the global economy in ways that generate durable rather than extractive growth. It would need a reckoning with the truth of its recent history, not the endless postponement of accountability that the amnesty laws have institutionalized, but the honest accounting of what happened during the Black Decade and who was responsible, not for the purpose of revenge but for the purpose of building the kind of institutional trust that genuine democracy requires. And it would need a political culture that is willing to hold in productive tension the multiple identities Arab and Amazigh, secular and Islamic, Mediterranean and Saharan, French-influenced and anti-colonial, that are all genuinely Algerian, rather than insisting that one version of Algerian identity must dominate and all the others must be subordinated to it. None of this is impossible. None of it is even particularly unusual. These are the challenges that many countries have navigated, with varying success, in the post-colonial period. What is unusual about Algeria is the combination of factors that makes the navigation simultaneously more urgent and more difficult. The demographic pressure of a young, growing population, the resource curse of hydrocarbon dependence, the institutional legacy of a military state that formed in war and has never found a way to reform itself in peace, and the historical trauma of the Black Decade, which hangs over everything like a shadow that the official narrative insists on not discussing. The young Algerians of the Hirak generation carry all of this. They carry it in the family silences about the 1990s. They carry it in the education system's selective memory of the revolution. They carry it in the smartphones through which they watch the world and compare their own condition to others. They carry it in the dignity and humor and stubbornness of a people who have been told for so long that they do not quite matter that they have developed an almost reflexive skepticism toward any claim made by authority. They are, in all of these ways, entirely Algerian heirs to 10,000 years of a tradition that says, we are still here, and we have not yet finished being who we are. The Mediterranean light falls on the ruins of Tingad in the early morning with the same quality it has always had: golden, specific, ancient. The Ouras Mountains hold the cold in their valleys in winter in the same way they held the FLN's fighters and their supply lines and their secrets. The Sahara spreads south in every direction from the Atlas Ranges with the same ferocious, indifferent beauty it has always had, the sand dunes moving imperceptibly in winds that have blown since long before there was anyone to name them. And in the cities, in Algiers climbing its hillside above the bay, in Oran spread across its plateau above the sea, in Constantine perched on its canyon of red rock, people are living their lives, working and arguing and loving and grieving and hoping and, above all, talking. Algerians talk. They talk with an intensity and a specificity and a humor that is, again, entirely characteristic, the inheritance of a people who have always had more to say than they were permitted to say publicly, and who have therefore developed the arts of the private conversation, the café argument, the family gathering, the text message, the subversive song to a very high level indeed. This talking, this incessant, intelligent, passionate, frustrated, funny, heartbroken Algerian talking, is, perhaps, the most reliable sign that Algeria is not finished. Countries that have given up do not talk like this. People who have accepted their condition do not produce this quality of argument about what their condition is and what it should be. The Hirak was, in many ways, just the talking made visible: millions of conversations that had been happening in private suddenly happening in the street, in the light, where everyone could see them, and now the conversations continue. In the coffee shops of Algiers, in the student cafeterias of Tizi Ouzou, in the WhatsApp groups of the diaspora in Paris and Montreal, in the poetry slams of Constantine and the hip-hop studios of Oran, in the offices of the human rights lawyers who are still working, despite everything, to document what happened during the Black Decade and to defend the activists arrested during and after the Hirak, in the laboratories of the Algerian scientists who are working on solar energy technology, and in the newsrooms of the independent online media that are trying to practice journalism in a country where journalism has always been a form of courage. The story is not over. It was never going to be over. Algeria has been telling its story since the first human hand reached out in the Tassili Anager and touched the stone of a world that needed a witness. It will be telling that story long after the current political crisis has been resolved or superseded by the next one, long after the last oil barrel has been pumped from beneath the Saharan sand, long after the current generation of generals and politicians and activists and artists has given way to the generation that comes after. The story continues because the land continues, and the people continue, and the unfinished promise of freedom, the promise made in the mountains of the Ouras on a November night in 1954, and before that by Abdelkader in his mountain redoubt, and before that by Al-Kahina on her Ouras ridge, and before that by Jugurtha in his Numidian campaigns against the finest army Rome had ever built. That promise has not expired. It does not expire. It is renewed with every generation that decides it is worth fighting for. That is Algeria. That is what it means to be a place where the Sahara meets the Mediterranean, where the oldest languages in Africa are still spoken in the mountains, where the ruins of Rome stand in the same soil that the first Algerian farmers worked 10,000 years ago, where the memory of martyrs and the aspirations of the living coexist in the same crowded, noisy, passionate, impossible, magnificent, enduring human space. That is Algeria. And it is, by any measure, enough.